The next morning Peter awoke, not really sure where he was. He was still under 30, so it was more that he was just disoriented than any else. Sleeping on the floor in a totally different place left him shaky, even after 3 safe houses. It was just too much for his sleep-drugged mind to process. After he rolled off the bed, it took boiling water poured through coffee grinds to finally remove his head from his butt. Whether it was manipulating the non-electric coffee maker, the time it took to do it, or the smell and taste of fresh coffee, it didn't much matter. The result was that the reality of his life came flooding back to him. He shook his head and concentrated on the plastic coffee maker, which came from the dry goods section of the consignment store. The plastic funnel came with a pack of 5 coffee filters, so coffee filters got added to his growing list of future purchases. The list ranged from the coffee filters to a microwave oven. Since the room was warm, the apartment must have come with utilities. It was even more evident in the fact that the stove and refrigerator both worked. The water had been on, but he had paid no attention to that. He did note the day before that he had hot water. Hell, the Marshalls could have arranged it all, he knew. If it were the Marshalls who were taking care of him, it looked as though they could have arranged some furniture, Peter thought. The flash drive informed him that he had a job interview at 9 a.m., so he could do his shopping on the way home. He flagged down a taxi and gave the driver an address. The ride would have been 10 minutes if it weren't for the traffic. The barely moving traffic made it 30 minutes that morning. Peter was surprised that the office for Just Act was in a strip mall. He was pretty sure that the office had been a retail store once upon a time. The renovations had obviously been minimal. There appeared to be 8 cubicles created by some kind of movable partition. They were not banking-type cubicles, so Peter felt sure they were just half walls nailed to the floor. To get to the receptionist's desk, Peter passed a busy waiting room. There were several men and women waiting for God only knew what. When he reached the empty desk, he stood waiting for several seconds. Then he called out, "Anybody home?" "Patience," a female voice said. "Sorry, I'll just come back another day," Peter said, turning to leave. He would have gladly waited for someone in particular to become free. However, he refused to get lost in the crowded waiting room while waiting for who or what. He had no idea. Peter almost got to the door before a middle-aged woman with really bad hair came around one of the half walls. She handed Peter a clipboard with a form and a pen. "Fill this out and have a seat. We will come get you in a bit." "Well, I think you are under the mistaken impression that I am a client," Peter said. "I'm Peter Sims, and I'm here to see the manager about a job." The redhead said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Please come on back." She led Peter back to the cubicle labeled Iva Gooding Manager. "Iva the pro from DC is here," the receptionist stated. The small, plain-looking woman who wore no makeup stood before she offered Peter her hand. "We are so happy to have you here," she said. "So what should we call you, Peter?" "Most people call me Deacon," Peter said. He came up with the name on his spot. He hoped that the completely different name would keep him on his toes. It was also the name of his very real uncle. "Okay, Deacon, we can really use your expertise," Iva said. "I hope you aren't expecting a computer expert or a lab operator." "I'm just an analyst," Peter said. "Yes, but you can read the police reports and explain what we are reading," the very plain-looking Iva Gooding suggested. "I can do more than that, but yes, I can do that as well," Peter said. "I'm sure we can put your skills to work. So tell me, are you settled into your new place?" "Other than the fact that I have no furniture, I'm doing pretty well. It's a lot like camping right now," Peter explained. "Do you need a couple of days to work on the apartment?" Iva asked. "I don't need much, so I am good to go anytime you want. I do need something to drive around, not for Jay, just to get back and forth. Problem is I don't know where anything is, and your traffic is awful. A lot of us are tree huggers here, so we ride bikes when the weather is nice. The cold might be a little much for you, but it would be easy enough to get around," Iva suggested. "We have a car available to use if you need to go anywhere. It's not for personal use, but we can work something out, I'm sure." "It's a thought. Maybe you could suggest a place where I could go browse," Peter asked. "Let's get you introduced to everyone before we do anything else. Then you can take the day off and come back tomorrow ready to work. Is that satisfactory?" Iva asked. "That's fine," Peter said. Most of the desks were cleaned off. They were obviously not in use by anyone. He was going to have several desks from which to choose when he was ready to work. Iva led him to a cubicle near the rear door. "Trish, this is Deacon Sims. He is the much-heralded records analyst and investigator. Deacon, this Trish, one of the 4 volunteer attorneys working here." Peter took her hand, then said, "Nice to meet you, Trish. How long have you been an attorney?" he asked. "I passed the bar last month," she said. "So I suppose you will be leaving when a big firm decides to offer you a job?" Peter asked. "I sent out some resumes, yes," she said honestly. Good for you, Peter said. Iva looked embarrassed as she walked him to the desk of a man at least 60 years old. Martin, this is Deacon Sims. He is our new analyst and investigator. How you doing, Deacon? Anything I can do to help you settle in, just let me know. I am the senior attorney here. You could tell me what it is that you all do here? Deacon asked. We try to find innocent men and women who have been incarcerated because of erroneous facts or incompetent people, Iva said. So the Just Act sign on the door is some kind of shorthand? Peter asked. Our full name is the Justice Action Team. We are part of a national movement started by young lawyers in New York. In the 5 years since it was formed, it has spread to major cities all over the country. So who pays the bills? Peter asked. Martin tried to give him a warning look, but Peter went on. I may not be the right fit for you. We are funded by the Justice Department. It's their lipstick on a pig attempt at good press. There are some other groups who contribute, and some wealthy patrons make contributions as well, she said. I see. You are telling me the clients don't pay anything for the service? Peter asked. Do you really care? She asked. Yes, I do. It goes to the splinter in the ER kind of thing, Peter said. Deacon, we screen these people well. Actually, you will be part of the screening process, Iva said. She walked to a cubicle near the empty reception desk. You have already met Helen. Helen, this is Deacon Sims. Helen is our computer genius and receptionist. Helen, Deacon is an analyst. He was formerly with the FBI. Iva said. Oh, why did you decide to come to bankrupt Detroit? Helen asked. I needed a change, Peter said, being mysterious. After he left the Just Act office, Peter walked around the strip mall. He found nothing of any interest, but he did note what businesses were for future reference. The businesses of most interest were the 2 restaurants and the grocery store. He knew for sure he didn't want to jog 5 miles home, so he called a taxi. While he waited, he checked for bicycle shops on the net using the office Wi-Fi. He found one named Bob's New and Used Bicycles. Since he had no idea how he would fare with a bike as local transportation in the winter, he thought he might be better to go with used. He thought he could also fit a stop at a big box store on the way home. He wanted to go to the bike shop first, then the big box store for a microwave oven before heading home. Peter found nothing at the bike shop, so he went to a discount store for a dorm-sized microwave. He knew that he could carry the lightweight microwave up the stairs. Peter, in just 2 days, learned to make trips outside the house serve several purposes. That night, he went back to the internet to order some items on eBay, using the prepaid credit card he had purchased at the big box store. He put $1,000 on it, so that he could use it on eBay and Amazon. The trick was to put the money on the prepaid card inside the department store, then moved it to PayPal. He hoped those moves would be untraceable from either end. He had to admit that Seth's flash drive had the double-blind credit card scheme. He also had to admit the 3-story climb discouraged him from the bicycle idea. He still liked it, but it just wouldn't work. On the morning of the second work day, Peter met his neighbor. He was an older, retired man. He seemed very pleasant. So Peter asked him, Does the building have a storage area for the tenants? Didn't they tell you when you rented the place? They will rent you a 10 by 10 space in the basement with a chain link fence around it. They charge $100 a month. Almost all the tenants have one, Mark said. Who do I see about getting one? Peter asked. You could call the realty office. Since they don't want to be bothered, they will assign you the space when you pay the first month's rent. That's just what I need. Is there an outside entrance? Peter asked. Of course, you can ask for the keypad code when you pay your fee, the old man said. Thanks a lot, Mark. You have been most helpful. I need something to ride to work 5 miles each way. I'm thinking about a bike. You should look on Craigslist. Is that all you need to store? He asked. It's all I'm planning for now, Peter said. Why not wait till you find something you like? Then if you wish, I can sublet you half my locker for $50 a month. If you need a ride to go see something, I will give you a lift, Mark said. I'm registered with Share the Ride, so it's much cheaper than a taxi. We can help each other out. Just give me a call anytime. Well, not after dark. I don't drive at night. You got it, my friend, Peter said. Peter was on the verge of asking him for a lift to work when the phone rang. Hello, Peter said. If you need a lift to work, be out front of your apartment in 10 minutes, Iva Gooding said. I would really appreciate it, Peter said. So what do you drive? A little blue Hyundai. Don't worry, I'll recognize you. Fair enough, Peter said. Good morning, Peter said to the still plain-looking Iva. Thanks for offering me the ride. I haven't had time to arrange transportation yet. I'm really not into mass transit. After 3 years in D.C., I would have thought you would be, she said. I had a department car. I was always on duty, he said. Kind of like a real cop, Iva said. Yeah, like that, he confirmed. You were some kind of spook, weren't you? She asked. Not at all. I just want a crime scenes to evaluate the evidence and offer suggestions on what to look for. If you say so, Deacon, she suggested. Have you had breakfast? No. If you are planning to stop somewhere, I'll buy, he suggested. I was thinking we could go through a place with a drive-in window. Do you have a preference? Iva asked. Not at all, Peter said. The two of them entered through the unlocked front door. The door was unlocked because the middle-aged redhead with her hair cut and colored like a teenager arrived before them. Good morning, Helen, Iva and Peter both said. Heckle and Jekyll are here to see you, Helen informed Iva. Deacon, Martin wants to see you, Helen said. Iva left Peter standing with Helen while she went to her office. She handed Peter the bag of food and coffee. I'll meet you in the break room. Don't drink all the coffee, she demanded. Peter walked back to the cubicle where he found Martin the day before. Martin, I haven't had breakfast yet, so if you need to talk to me, urgently come to the break room, otherwise I'll be back in a few minutes, Peter said. I need some coffee, so I'll join you, the much older man replied. Good, Peter said. 2 minutes later, Peter bit into his bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit. Now that's really good, he said. My cholesterol rose 2 points just being in the same room with you, Martin said with a smile. So what do you want to talk about? Peter asked. Stop by my office when you get a chance. I have something that has been on my mind for a year or more, Martin said. That is a long time. What is it? Peter asked. It was a case I prosecuted when I was with the DA's office, Martin said. Was it prosecutorial misconduct? Peter asked. No, Deacon. We followed all the rules religiously. It's something we didn't know. Come by my desk, get the file, and do what you do, Martin demanded. Is this a real client, or is it personal? Martin, we all have ghosts, Peter replied. Just look it over, please, Martin said. Okay. Are we keeping the others in the dark? Peter asked. For now, please, Martin said. After his coffee and biscuit with Martin, Iva came in with 2 lawyers who looked well cared for and were volunteers from the NAACP Legal Defense Department, he was told. Peter didn't even bother to listen to their names. They became Heckle and Jekyll to him as well. One was male and one was female. They were both well educated, and he was pretty sure well off financially. They most likely had demons to deal with. It was hard to be lumped in with other people because of your race. He had dealt with Paco Gomez's men, so he knew a little about it from personal experience. Their race issues were often settled with a bullet to the brain. I couldn't tell Heckle and Jekyll that. Good morning, Mr. Sims, Heckle said. He was the male member of the duo. Good morning, and it's Deacon. I don't stand much on formality, Peter said. I'm afraid I do, the man said smugly. Then I suggest you go through Iva, if you need to talk to me. I really am serious. Formality gets in the way of what I do, Peter said. I have one of those awful names given to kids by poor mothers back in the 80s, but now it's Marcia, the woman less than 10 years older than Peter, said with a warm smile. We are all victims of our childhood. Keeping that in mind makes me a lot less judgmental, Peter said, taking her hand. That works for you? Heckle said. Actually, it does. I have to keep an open mind. When I do what I do, I also have to be able to see things from both sides. The truth is a very complex thing. There is no truth, only versions of the truth, Peter said. He figured he would be able to work with Heckle, since they both knew where they stood. That is if he wanted to work together. That's very interesting, Jekyll said. You and I should discuss truth someday. It would be my pleasure, Peter said. They all shook hands and parted company. Iva was close enough to hear Peter whisper a-hole. Which one? She asked aloud. Heckle, he announced, showing no shame at all in the obvious slur. I allow Helen to say that because she is harmless, but you may be dealing with him. I do not expect to ever hear that again. Iva said. I think we need to get something straight right now. Whatever you are paying me, it isn't enough to talk to me like that, Peter said. Just Act isn't paying you at all, she said. Then I suggest we just call me a consultant and I work from home. I do not intend to put up with petty rules and policies for nothing. So it's either that or I'm prepared to call our relationship over. In the words of the first male in America to get a divorce, we will just split the blankets. You are serious. The support of those two is vital to the Just Act mission, Iva said. Well, then you need to do what you need to do, Peter said. If you decide to keep me, I want a $50K per year salary and I don't care who pays it. When something is free, it has no value to the receiver. It isn't about the money. Now I'm going to walk to the restaurant next door and do some research. During his search of Craigslist, he found a lightweight bicycle converted to an electric scooter. It was narrower than a tricycle and had no pedals. He was very interested since it had no visible motor. It also seemed lightweight and not difficult to maneuver. There was a phone number, so he used the new burner phone to call it. He discovered the scooter had a 48 to 60-volt 1200-watt hub motor. It, however, did not come with a battery pack. He would need an expensive lithium battery pack. The battery pack in a 48 V20A size ran about $500. Even the fact that the bike was another $500 seemed like a good deal compared to a taxi to and from the office at a cost of $20 a day, not to mention other trips around town. Pete called for a share-a-ride pickup truck. The trip was from the restaurant to the man who built the bike's home. The man obviously charged $100 to assemble the scooters, which Peter thought a fair price indeed. By 6 p.m., he had the scooter in the storage cage belonging to neighbor Mark. So he went to his place with a set of batteries and a charger. The batteries were lead for the time being. He knew that he would place an order for the state-of-the-art lithium batteries that very night. It would still take over a month to get it. It was a little after 7 a.m. when the phone rang. "Do you need a ride to work?" Iva's voice came over the phone. After their falling out, the plain Iva became the ugly Iva. "I thought I had been fired?" Peter made it a question. "I called to see if you had quit," Iva said. "Let me suggest this. You cover my expenses while I'm here for a month's trial run. If you think I'm useless, we call it quits and go our separate ways," he suggested. "With half a blanket each," Iva suggested. "That's right," Peter said. "Fair enough, Deacon. So do you need a ride?" she asked again. "I'm going to give it a try on my own. There is a possibility I will need rescuing. Tell me you will come get me if I do," he demanded. "If I get to laugh at you," she said with a hint of laughter in her voice. Peter dressed in thermal underwear, a pair of Dickie cargo pants, a second long-sleeve tee over the thermal t-shirt, a sweatshirt, a scarf covering his face, the heavy blue parka and goggles. After he rolled the scooter out, he put on the bicycle helmet and started off carefully. He was surprised how stable the scooter was. It also fit just fine into the bike lane. The bike lane was reserved for two-wheel people-powered vehicles. He knew he could get a ticket, but he stayed in them whenever he could. The 5-mile trip was over level ground, so he made it in 20 minutes. It seemed longer because of the bone-chilling cold wind which struck him in the face all the way to the office. Peter found a dead spot in the parking lot where he wasn't taking up a parking space, but was out of the traffic flow. He chained the scooter to a light pole before removing the batteries. He carried them inside to charge while he worked. He bypassed Iva, the ugly's, desk in order to get to Martin's. "Martin, come to the break room and bring the file," he demanded. "Could we go next door instead?" "This might be embarrassing," Martin replied. "Give me the file and I'll read over it first. Then we can meet outside the office to discuss it." "Don't you need some background?" Martin asked. "Not before I read the facts," Peter said. He took the blue plastic Ziploc pouch from Martin's outstretched hand. The bag was filled with photocopies. Martin had either collected them while working in the DA's office, or he had someone photocopy them after he left. Either way, it seemed complete. Peter went to an empty cubicle and began to read them. It took all morning. The narrative went, a call came in at 10:30 p.m. on a Thursday night. The dispatcher assigned the call to Patrolman First Class Samuel Waters. Waters was a 5-year veteran. He arrived and found a male holding a wild club arguing with his wife. When the male suspect saw the officer, he raised the club and stepped toward the officer in a threatening manner. The officer fired in self-defense. One shot to the head ended the suspect's life. Since it was a normal shooting, there was nothing to cause a media shitstorm. It was just a shooting within all the guidelines. A quick investigation by the Internal Affairs Division, and he was cleared. The DA declined to prosecute the officer or even to investigate it. The last piece of paperwork was a marriage license. The names were Sam Waters and Vicky Everett. You guessed it, Vicky was the wife being threatened. The night Officer Waters shot her husband. Peter carried the file back to Martin's desk. He threw it down, then said, "He got away with murder," Peter said. "Not exactly. We declined to prosecute. We didn't dismiss it with prejudice attached. The DA can still bring charges. He will not do it without evidence. It will make every case Waters has been involved with shaky." "Has anyone asked him about the coincidence of their marriage?" Peter asked. His story is that he never met Vicky before that night. They became friends during the investigation. "I noted that the victim had a rap sheet for domestic violence," Peter said. "Slapping your wife around isn't a capital offense. Maybe it should be, but he didn't have the right to execute him," Martin said. "If it went down like you expect, then she is a co-conspirator at least. She might be the one who worked it all out. Waters might have been just a pawn," Peter suggested. "So what do we do?" Martin asked. "Hey, I analyzed the file, and I think there is something worth an investigation." "That's what I do, Martin. Get Iva to sign off, and I will ask some questions," Peter said. "Did you make the decision to give the cop a pass?" "Yes," Martin replied. "Stop beating yourself up. Based on the facts that were available at the time, anyone would have done the same. Murder or self-defense, the forensics could have gone either way. What did you notice that I missed? Martin asked. One shot from 10 to 15 feet away in a dimly lit room. From a presumable frightened beat cop, and it goes right in his head. It's what I call a kill shot without any hesitation. I also noticed he was not a combat soldier. That kind of cool either comes from killing before or having a plan. It is not the kind of shot an officer makes while being under attack, Peter said. More like Sam told him to drop the bat, and when he did, Sam put one in his brain pan. At least that is what came to mind after reading the fairy tales in that file. Now get Iva on board so we can use Helen. Peter had skipped lunch while he read the files all morning. He was in the break room eating a frozen chicken pot pie when Martin entered. Okay, Iva's on board. We get Helen for one day starting tomorrow. Good, then we need to prepare a list of things we need her to do. We need to maximize her time. We obviously aren't ready to interview Mr. and Mrs. Waters. First of all, I want to know if Sam was married at the time of the shooting. If he was, how was the marriage? How was the victim's marriage before the shooting? If she was seeing Sam, they had to have met someplace. We need to get a lead of where it was. We also need to find out where she worked so we can interview her fellow employees and the neighbor where she lived the night of the shooting. We need background in order to determine where to put our limited resources, Peter commented. Good. Sounds like you know what you are doing, Wilson said. You are not doing to drop a bomb like this, then just sit back and watch. You should know what information is available through the courts. So check it all, Peter suggested. It took all day, but they made progress. Peter called a meeting with Martin, Helen, and Iva an hour before the end of the day. Helen, how did the background? Peter asked. I just worked on the questions you asked. I found a few neighbors who remembered Vicky and her husband. I heard from two that she had a black eye now and then. There was definitely a lot of shouting going on there. So Helen, do you think she would have been a candidate for a strong protector figure? Peter asked. Yes, Deacon, I think she was, Helen said. So was Sam Waters married at the time? Peter asked. He was indeed, Martin asked. A search through the files at the courthouse gave up his wife's name. It also gave the date that his divorce was final, exactly 6 months after the shooting. My guess was that he had been seeing Vicky the 304 during the 6 months before he shot and killed her husband. Now we just need someone to say that. Get that, and you have something to make the DA sit up and take notice, Peter said. You know he isn't going to let anything slip, Martin said. You can bet the farm on that, Iva said. That is probably true. What we have to do is prove one instance of him lying to the investigator form IA, Peter said. You had access to the IA report. So what do you think is the M0SD obvious thing he lied about? And how do we prove it? How about we use his credit cards to determine where he was spending his money the 6 months before he shot Mr. Everett, Helen said. Do we need a warrant? Iva asked. Of course we do, Martin said. But we aren't going to get on unless we have a witness that puts them together before her husband was killed. Then, I gave you your 24 hours. Put it on the back burner, Iva demanded as she stood to leave. Remember, tread lightly, this could wreck our relationship with the DPD. After Iva left the break room, Peter asked, do we have a relationship with the Detroit Police Department? Sure, in her mind, Helen said. She calls a police captain and he routes our questions to the appropriate office, who may or may not bother to answer. After 3 attempts we move on. That's her idea of cooperation, Martin explained. Does that mean I can't call directly to a police officer? Peter asked. Afraid so, Helen replied. Do you have a list of the Detroit Police Department heads? Peter asked. Either or both of them. I can get you a name, Helen said. It's amazing the things a married cop will do to get a BJ. He will do even more to keep it quiet, Helen said with a laugh. My God, I was wrong about you. You are going to make an ideal partner, Peter said. Find out who I need to talk to in order to get information on the internal affairs investigation. The things that didn't make it into the report for political reasons. Someone might have already plowed this ground, Peter suggested. I'll get you a name, but I won't give him a BJ for it. That was a joke, Helen said. Can I join the rebellion? Trish said from the door. There is no rebellion, Martin said. Just a little plotting. You have to swear your allegiance, Peter said, joking. Swearing means nothing if you don't believe in anything, she said. She does have a point, Peter said. It seemed that nobody took Trish seriously. If you join, you have to buy the next round of coffee. Sure, if one of you will loan me a sawbuck, she said, trying to sound like a 1920 gangster. Oh hell, she has been to the retro movie house again, Helen said. Since Trish was almost junkie thin, she was never going to be able to pull off the tough gun mall persona. You need to ask Martin or Helen since I'm not on salary, Peter informed her. Peter looked at Helen. smiled wickedly, then said, "How would you feel about a judicial BJ?" The question seemed to strike the other two hilarious. Martin spit coffee out rather than drown. "You okay, Martin?" Peter asked after he was sure that Martin was breathing. "I sure hope so, because I am not giving a strange man mouth to mouth. It's not the image a new guy should present." "I'm not either," Trish said. "Attorneys are known to screw each other, but not to swap spit. It wouldn't look good on my resume." "As for me, I don't like you, Martin," Helen said. "I guess I better stay healthy then," he said with a smile. You realize the conversation has gone from catching a killer to discussing BJs. Time passes and people move on to BJs, Peter said. "You guys are BJ obsessed, Trish?" Somehow I feel Helen would give a first-class one, since she brought the subject up. "How about you, Trish?" Peter asked. "I never had a complaint," she said. "You know, I can't see any man complaining no matter how bad it was. Unless, of course, the girl bites," Helen said. "On that note, I'm going to work," Peter said. "Deke, could we talk?" Trish asked. "Sure, why not?" Peter said as he looked at Helen and shrugged his shoulders. "Your cube or mine?" "Parking lot. The cubes have ears," she said. "So what did you want?" Peter asked Trish. "I wasn't kidding. I want to be part of your group," she answered. "Don't you get it? There is no group. I'm just looking into this case in my spare time, which you are taking up. I had permission to work on it till the end of the day. Anything we do after today is off the books and will screw up your recommendations from AITA. This is not some glamorous revolution. It's just a lark," Peter replied. "Deacon, it's something that isn't just a piece of paper being moved from one place to another." Trish seemed to be almost begging. "I need the real-life experience for my resume." "That I can believe," Peter said. "Okay, ask Helen to put you to work finding out how Waters really met Vicky." "I'm thinking an earlier call." No one checked because no one questioned his version. Cops work in sectors. There is a good chance he had an earlier call at her house. "Why don't we go talk to the neighbor who gave you guys the other information about shouting in the house?" Trish asked. "That's a good idea, Trish. If the cops have been called before, we might get a timeline, maybe even someone who saw Waters there." Helen is looking for patterns in his spending. "I'm going to squeeze in a visit to Waters' ex today." Rachel Waters was working at a call center. It was a slightly better than minimum wage job. It meant that Peter had to visit her at home. According to her neighbors, she was home usually after 6 p.m. Helen dug out all of that for him. "Trish, you want to help? I will take you to dinner after work if you drive me to an interview with the former Mrs. Waters," Peter suggested. "Where are we going for dinner?" she asked. "I don't know. Somewhere not too formal. Otherwise, it's up to you," Peter said. "Do you like ethnic food?" she asked. "Tex-Mex is about as ethnic as I get," he replied. He would have added Big Macs from a trash can was as far down as he ever got. He would have told her, except he knew that he would have to explain it. "Would you try Chinese if I order for you?" she suggested. "As long as it doesn't have any chicken, I can do it," he said. The rest of the day passed with nothing new to add to the file. Mostly because Helen was put to work by AITA on the case of a man accused of robbing a convenience store. Peter was sure the kid was guilty after reading the files. He told AITA that the odds were about a 100 to 1 that there was any police misconduct or any misinterpreted evidence. He should have pleaded to it for a shorter sentence, Peter said in conclusion. "You don't make those decisions," she said. "Just give me your opinion on the police reports," AITA the Ugly demanded in an equally ugly tone. "You are still looking into the Waters thing, aren't you?" "I'm not going to lie to you." "I am not," he said, telling her a blatant lie. "Good," she said. There was some truth to his story. He hadn't looked into it for over an hour, he thought. It was 5:45 by the time Peter had secured his three-wheel scooter. To his surprise, Trish showed up with boxes of takeout. He had been standing by the front door for about 10 minutes thinking he would be running out to the street to jump in her car. She ambushed him from the rear instead. "I thought it might be more fun to see your apartment," she said, not acting one bit different from her office persona. "Cold and unemotional." "Good. Come on, we will try the elevator. It is powered by a burrow in the basement," he said. Upstairs, her comment on his apartment was very minimalist. She brought 2 sample plates from a Chinese restaurant. Each had a 1 serving of 4 different menu items. They shared them all, but only after he settled up the bill with her. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Sure I do. I invited you to dinner." "Okay, but you didn't really," she said. Her voice never changed. It wasn't exactly a monotone as much as a lack of emotions. Nothing showed any emotion when she spoke. She seemed to be struggling trying to find just the right word and tone. He thought she might be trying to cover her lack of emotion with some kind of intellectual decision that certain situations needed a particular emotion. After dinner, they drove to the home of Rachel Waters. The house was no doubt a rental. "It looks a lot like the house I rent," Trish said coldly. Rachel answered the door to their knock. "Hi, Miss Waters, my name is Peter Sims. This is my colleague Trish. Would like to ask you some questions about your ex-husband." She looked back into the house before answering, "Could we talk out here? My son is in the house. I'd rather him not hear all the things I have to say about his father," she said. "Would you like to get your coat? This won't take long, but it's cold as hell out here," Peter said. "No, like you said, it won't take long," she said it as a warning. "Okay, let me get right to it then. In the months leading up to your divorce, was your husband acting any differently?" Peter asked. "Different?" she asked. "You know, like being gone after work for hours? Or any new hobbies?" Trish asked with that phony concern in her voice. "Long periods of time where you didn't know where he was? Anything like unexplained charges on his credit card?" Peter added. "Why are you asking all this?" Rachel asked. "To be honest, we want to know if he and his present wife were having an affair. We are really investigating her for the family of her deceased husband," Peter said. "Oh, I see," Rachel said. "I don't know who it was, but it could have been her. Someone rode by the house almost every time he was home at night. You know, he worked rotating shifts. He was only home 2 out of 3 nights. Even then, he found excuses to be gone after our son was in bed. There was always a cop who needed to move something. He also got a lot of text messages," Rachel suggested. "He even went fishing with his friends on his 4-day break once or twice. Just a couple of days at a time," she explained. The boy came to the door. "If that's all, I need to fix dinner," she said. "Of course," Peter said. Peter and Trish both said goodbye and thanked her for her time. "Well, what do you think?" Trish asked. "Oh, he was definitely having it off with someone," Peter said. "Yes, I got that impression. You do know that only officers or employees of the government need a warrant to get phone records. If we can get them legally, we don't need prior approval. Trish, they are confidential records and someone would get there but in a sling giving them up to us. Peter, if we paid for them, that would be the seller's problem. If we cooperated but honestly didn't know who was providing them, we could wiggle out of the charge. I am going to assume that you know someone at the phone company?" Peter asked. "I do, if he was a nationwide cell network user," she said with a smile. "Get me his data for the time we are interested in and I will change my mind about you being a fluff-headed debutante," Peter said. "You really know how to sweep a girl off her feet." "I know a man who knows a man who knows a phone number," she said. "Give me the information and I won't give you up," Peter promised. "By end of business tomorrow, I will know if I can do it," Trish promised. "Maybe we won't need it, but better to have the number and not use it than to need it and not have it," Peter said. "How about inviting me up for coffee?" Trish asked when they were parked outside his building. "Sure, but as you saw earlier, there are no comfortable chairs," Peter added. "Well, Deacon, I sure we can figure out something," she said. Once in the apartment, she sat on the folding chair while Peter made the coffee. He used a plastic measuring cup with a handle to boil 2 cups of water at a time in the tiny microwave. The water was poured into the tall plastic funnel with a coffee filter and 2 tablespoons of coffee grounds inside. The resulting coffee draining into a second plastic measuring cup. Peter poured coffee from it into a styrofoam cup for Trish and a hard plastic Delta cup for himself. His cup came from the thrift store. It had some medical clinics advertising on it. "That is really good coffee. I have only one complaint. Your cup is much cooler than mine," she said. Her voice was again measured and pretty much fake. He had decided early on that she wasn't talking down to him, even though it seemed that way. "So I see you have the small screen TV," she said. "I have to be able to carry whatever I buy up the stairs," Peter explained. She looked at him very seriously, then out of the blue she asked, "Do you want to have sex with me?" "I really don't know. Is that a lawyer's trick question?" Pete said. "Of course not," Trish said with almost some emotion. "How about telling me, Trish, why did you ask that?" Peter said. "A simple no would have been sufficient," she said. "Okay, not right now," he admitted. "Then I should go," she said. "I'll get that number for you." "Trish, are you okay?" Peter said. "Sure, in spite of what they say, men can say no. At least they can to me," she said. "I would say no to anyone tonight." He was trying to be nice. "I hear that a lot as well," Trish replied. "Screw it," he thought. "Come here," he said, pulling her against him. He kissed her gently. It got rough. Their clothes went away. Trish was actually quite thin without her clothes. Peter liked that about her. He also liked that she was obviously enjoying it, without making a sound. She was very much in control but not controlling. She just gave into it while restraining herself. "You okay?" he asked after it was over. She was sitting up in his air bed on the floor, trying to determine which of her clothes were suitable to wear out. She wore one of his recently purchased sweatshirts under the jacket of her little power suit. It was a strange-looking Trish who left his apartment. Peter walked her to her car with the intent of kissing her goodbye, but she had other plans. She got into her car and drove quickly away. "Damn," he said to no one. Then he laughed at the absurdity of the situation. Helen greeted him the next morning with, he answered 2 previous domestic disturbance complaints at her house. She said, "Beautiful, let's ask Martin if it's enough." Peter said, "It's a damn good start, but it's just conjecture. He is going to say, I don't remember ever seeing her before. I might have been off those nights. The unit could have had a different driver, or she didn't make an impression." Martin said, "Yeah, he would be too smart to fold his tent on that little bit of evidence. We are not going to be able to interrogate him, so it's going to have to be locked down tight for the DA's man, or enough to get the IAD involved." "Okay, we need something more," Peter said, leaving Martin's cubbyhole. He resisted the urge to kick a chair on the way out. When Peter passed Trish, she didn't even acknowledge his existence. It was like she didn't recognize him. The worst thing he realized was that she wasn't trying to avoid the truth. She just had no further interest in him. Peter walked back to his cubbyhole to read another file, looking for police misconduct. It was one which had been reviewed by both Martin and Trish for legal issues. They had found nothing. Peter reviewed the report on the evidence and the police department's conduct of the investigation. At the time of his review, DNA was the hot button. The questions were mind-boggling. Was there DNA present, and whose was it? Were the places where DNA should have been found, but it wasn't? If not, why not? All those questions came into play in the review Peter did. His greatest value to the team was he knew what cops were capable of, so he questioned everything. If something seemed a little out of plumb, he wanted to know why. He had begun to lose my blind faith in the cops when he witnessed them selling narcotics from squad cars. The final straw was when his house was burned. Or maybe it was when he discovered a hit team was on the way. A hit team dispatched by the FBI agent sent to keep me alive. His skepticism made him the ideal person for the job. The Just Act case on his desk seemed to be both plumb and level. His recommendation was going to be, tell the kid convicted in the death of another kid whose only crime was not being a street thug, that his DNA was everywhere since he cut himself while stabbing the victim. His blood was on the victim's clothes and even in the wound. The knife had his DNA and bloody fingerprints on it. The kid doing the time was lucky the cops didn't turn him over to the victim's family. The Detroit cops had a public relations problem more than anything else. "You have to face it, Iva," Peter said. "Most of the time the cops get it right." "That's not been my experience," she said. "This time they did. So don't waste your time and reputation on this one," Peter said. "I'm beginning to wonder about that fit thing you talked about." "You have reviewed 2 cases and upheld the cops both times," Iva said. "I'm not going to call a spade a heart just because that's what you want. If I do, then no one will take me seriously, and rightly so." I left her office at noon feeling pretty down on the whole operation. Waters was careful, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Helen said, "Do we have him, Peter?" According to his ex-wife, who called Trish this morning while you were involved with Iva the Terrible, she remembered a 3-day fishing trip Officer Waters took the year before the fatal shooting. She remembered it because the fishing lodge charge on the card was for over $200 per day. She thought that was too much for a fishing trip at a lodge. I called the lodge and found out the dates that Waters' party was registered. They even sent me the video from the hold-up camera. It is the only camera inside the lodge. I found Vicky the Tramp and Officer Waters checking in. I also found them on the parking lot camera several times over the next 2 days. "You got his lying butt," Peter said. "We got him," Helen corrected him. "Truth is, you and Trish got him. Now the sad truth is we have to give it up to internal affairs." Peter said, "There are 2 things I want for all my hard work." Helen said, "One is to see Waters charged with murder. The other is to see a comfortable chair in your living room. Trish told me that you have nowhere to sit when we come to visit. God knows every gang needs a clubhouse," she advised him. "We are not a gang, and my place is not going to become a clubhouse for you misfits," Peter said with a smile. "Maybe we could get a tax exemption as a religious order," Helen suggested. "I know I would make a terrible monk, and most likely you are no nun," Peter suggested. "You know firsthand that our Trish is no Virgin Mary," Helen replied, sounding almost jealous. "So Trish kisses and tells," Peter suggested. "Oh yes, and you only got a 7 from her," Helen added. 7? "I intend to appeal that," Peter replied. "Do you get the impression Trish has a filter on her emotions?" Helen asked. "That's a kind way to put it," Peter replied. "She may bring an assault rifle to the office and wipe us out someday," Peter admitted. Then you need to have me over for breakfast soon. First buy a chair and a bed. I can't get up and down off the floor. Bad knees. I did too much running when I was younger, she said. So do you have a picture of yourself in the spandex shorts and tight top? Peter asked. Of course I do. I even have one of me laid out on the ground with the marathon EMTs checking me for a heart attack. You can see them when we go out. Well, then I will go buy a bed and a chair, but it will have to be a small bed, Peter replied. Let's meet with Iva the Terrible and have her put internal affairs onto Waters. Then you can take me and Trish to lunch, Helen suggested. Sounds good, Peter said. When he and Helen informed Martin of the information, he and Trish, Peter, and Helen met in the coffee room, where Iva joined them. They braced for the inevitable, but chewing they knew was coming. You know you were told to drop this, so there is no need to explain that you are guilty of using our resources to conduct an unauthorized investigation. I could fire you all, and I would if you were paid employees. Since all of you, except Helen, are volunteers, of one kind or another, it would be shooting myself in the foot. So I will just say, good job everyone. Who are you and where is Iva the Terrible? Peter asked jokingly. Watch your mouth, Deacon, you are still on probation, Iva said with a smile. Of course the month isn't over yet, Peter said. So what's next for you? Iva said. How about trying to look through that backlog of files? I take care of them as soon as Martin and Trish finish their analysis. I will set a meeting with the IAD people for tomorrow. Iva said, you are about to see your working relationship change. Cops don't like people who stand up to them, Peter said. You do something about that bed situation tonight? Helen demanded once the meeting broke up. I have a terrible itch and I think you have the cure. Besides, Trish and I need something in common to talk about, Helen said. Good Lord, tell me you aren't thinking about trying to be girly with Trish. As far as I can tell, she has even less of a personality than me, Peter said. Not girly as in switching teams. She just seems to need a friend and maybe some female advice, Helen said. Funny, she was here when I came 6 months ago. I have always avoided her, but today she caught me in the break room. She wanted to discuss you. I have no idea what that is about, Peter replied. It was about her trying to fit into the team, as she called us. Did you really sleep with the cold witch? Helen asked. You know what they say about men with their excitement having no conscience? Well, it's true, Peter said. He went back to reading the newest file to cross his desk. He stayed at it till 5 even though it took 3 cups of coffee. At 5 he left the office parking lot on his bike. He rode straight to the consignment shop. What he found there was a nylon comforter and a camp bed sort of thing. The metal bed frame with folding legs was the size of a standard bunk bed, which turned out to be only a couple of inches narrower than his twin airbed. Peter paid for the comforter and 2 larger pillows, which he rolled together then secured it using his belt. He managed to tie it onto the frame of the scooter. It was a tight fit, but as expected he made it home. Once at the Don Juan, he stored the bike in the basement after removing the battery pack. He lugged the batteries as well as the comforter up to his apartment. When he arrived, he plugged the batteries into the charging station. He also took a moment to throw the comforter and pillows onto the floor. He was back on the street dressed in his heavy parka, but without the other 2 layers of outerwear. Peter made the 2-block walk to the consignment shop before he got too cold. Walking double time made it a little easier to bear the cold. It also kept him out in the cold a shorter amount of time. At the shop he paid $20 for the bed frame. It was complete with 1-inch wide strips of steel for springs. He paid and carried the heavier than it looked frame home. It was a cold, dark, and miserable trip, but he made it. He stopped in the small lobby to warm by the radiator before climbing the stairs, dragging the bed frame behind. He pulled the folded bed ends out and locked them into place. Then he carefully folded the comforter to make a pad to cover the springs before he placed the airbed on top of it. After that he placed the sheets and a second heavy comforter on the bed. He also had a bedspread to add the illusion of a sofa. That was his only concession to Helen's demand for a comfortable chair. After Peter slept the best he ever had since arriving in Detroit, he made coffee the way he had made it for Trish, the cold fish. The coffee was Colombian. Peter was glad that there was another product beside coca leaves coming out of Colombia. While the water made its way through the filter and into the second plastic cup, he filled a bowl with cereal and milk. All of his furnishing and most of his packaged food came from the consignment shop or the dollar store beside it. Why not the dollar store and the consignment store were close and cheap? Those were 2 of his priorities for laying low. Don't get noticed was the issue on his mind most. Since he had eaten a bowl of cereal in his own small kitchen, he was in no hurry to get moving. He turned on his TV to watch the morning news. Every day someone else was witching about the terms of the bankruptcy. They acted as though it was an act of God. None of the whiners ever admitted that the city's politicians had robbed the city blind over the years. As long as the perks kept coming, nobody seemed to have cared that there was a bill to be paid someday. The whole damn town had learned to live as if there were no tomorrow. When tomorrow came and the bills finally came due, they tried to blame the bill collector. When the court started to sell off the assets, there was witching, moaning, and gnashing of teeth about it. The city was forced to double the rate for a bus ride across town. That one almost caused a riot. They cut the number of city employees, which meant that the cop and fire department's response time went up. Less cops also meant that the number of arrests went down. The city was quickly slipping into a breeding ground for unrest. Peter thanked God that he wasn't a real resident of Detroit. He was just another do-gooder who was most likely doing more harm than good. Detroit had taken on the national mentality of Washington. Just don't do anything stupid. That meant trying to never make a decision. Detroit had lost the ability to ignore its debt. So like Washington, it whined about the only thing handy, the administrator and the judges on the bankruptcy court. Roger wondered what would happen next. Worst case, the neighborhood watch would become the neighborhood militia. Then it would be Baghdad on the lake. Hell, Detroit might invade Windsor, Canada. The world was spiraling out of control. Peter said to the TV as if the stunning blonde could hear him. The cold ride to work after the sun came up put it all in perspective. He would have wished for a free ride to work in a warm car. It all came down to the individual. Peter would rather freeze his butt off on the 20-minute ride to work than to freeze his butt off in a protest march. Peter really didn't know what that made him. Maybe it made him a tourist. He chewed on that during his ride to work in the bike lanes. He had a close call at one of the intersections. An automobile tried to jump the light as he passed through under a caution. Just another day in beautiful Detroit, he thought. So did you buy a bed? Helen asked as he filled a styrofoam coffee cup in the break room. I told you that I would. I always keep my promises, Peter replied. However, it is small, but I slept fine on it. Well, enjoy your sleep tonight. Tomorrow is Friday, Helen said. We have a date. I don't remember inviting you out, Peter said. I invited you out, Helen whispered. I enticed you with the promise of sex, so don't screw it up. Well, I guess I do want you to screw it up, she said with a wicked laugh. Helen was one of those women searching for a new identity. She had been Helen's wife and mother for close to 20 years, then she was Helen's single mom until the realization that her kid was ready for college set in. Then Helen didn't think she had an identity. She just drifted into Helen the Vamp. Actually, everybody loved the outspoken Helen, which only served to reinforce her slightly over-the-top behavior. She also discovered that she loved sex. Hell, 40 is a hell of a time to discover that you love sex. I'm talking sex, just for the sake of sex. It's a time for a new direction in life, from Helen wife and mother to Helen the witch. The transition wasn't at all painful, she discovered. She just kept her home life separate from her trashy identity. Peter's day passed reading reports while he waited for the results of Iva's meeting with the Detroit PD. They are going to verify that they have a case, then they will take it to a grand jury, since the current DA doesn't want to touch it. So he is going to punt it to the grand jury. Iva explained. So what is IAD going to do? Martin asked. They will re-interview him. I asked that you and Trish be allowed to be present. Iva informed them all. So what did they say? Martin asked. They will allow Trish to be present. Sorry, Martin, they think the rest of us have a vested interest. Iva said. She gave Trish a bit of a nasty look. Don't get too excited. They expect the interview to take a week to schedule, then another couple of weeks to get on the grand jury docket. The one I want to talk to is Vicky, Helen commented. I bet you $10 she is the instigator. I'll take that bet, Trish said, smiling. The two women smiled warmly. Nobody else noticed, but Peter was disturbed by it. He knew he should not have slept with Trish, and yet he was planning to sleep with Helen. I seemed like a really bad idea, had morphed into a nightmare. For Peter, the rest of Thursday was nothing short of a day filled with a string of boring chores. He read 2 files front to back looking for discrepancies. As usual, the ones he found didn't amount to anything. They did suggest other avenues of investigation. Peter made stick-up notes on the files for Iva to decide the best use of their limited resources. At 5 o'clock, Peter went into one of the several empty cubicles that he had designated a dressing cubby, where he added the several layers of clothing for his ride home. Since he had discovered the thrift store, his wardrobe had more than tripped. He still bought work clothes in the big box stores, but he also bought the exterior layers at the thrift store. Those were the ones he wore over his work clothes on the ride to and from home. The 5-mile ride in the freezing weather was a pretty miserable trip. If he caught the traffic just right, it was 20 to 30 minutes of frozen hell. He could also be stuck in traffic much longer, in which case he intended to just stop in a convenience store or a restaurant on the side of the road. He thanked God that the Just Act office wasn't in the downtown itself. On Thursday evening, he did get cold on the way home, so he chained and locked the bike to a streetlight pole, then went into a convenience store for a cup of coffee to warm my hands. Even with the ski gloves, they were cold and almost painful. Even though he had charged the battery pack at home and work, it was almost dead. The new and better battery pack had not arrived at that time. He saw the kid at a shelf in the rear of the store. The kid couldn't have been more than 16. He kept glancing at the clerk with dancing eyes. Peter was pretty sure he was trying to build his courage to try a robbery. Peter had no idea where it came from, but he knew for sure that it was going to happen. Peter moved to stand beside him. "Son, don't do it. If you do this and live, you will end up in prison with a bigger thugs beat up your butt. Not a good outcome. Just walk out the door and stay free and alive." "I don't know what you were talking about," the kid said. "Up to you, kid, but you ain't going to turn back, and they ain't gonna give up once they get your face on the camera there. Next stop for you is prison or the crematorium." After making sure the kid saw the camera, Peter then went to the counter to pay for his coffee. He noticed the kid rush out behind him. He got on his bike and rode it another 10 minutes home. Friday came and went, much like Helen. Helen proved to be funny, forward, and sexy. For a woman over 40, she was very attractive even without her clothes. Peter enjoyed her company as much as the sexual experience. Helen was just good fun whether in or out of bed. Saturday morning the weather turned just plain nasty. It was snowing almost hard enough to be a whiteout. The 25-mile-an-hour wind off the lake made it just plain brutal. Since it started to snow the night before while they were eating dinner, Peter had stopped at a donut shop on the way home from dinner. That made it possible for the two of them to return to bed after breakfast. Good coffee and mediocre donuts were on the menu at Cafe Peter Sims. After breakfast, Helen was on the menu. They stayed in the warm, but cramped bed until 2 p.m. "Get your sorry but out of bed and let's go to that restaurant I saw in the next block," Helen demanded. "Okay, but we should leave a note in case we get lost in the blizzard," Peter said. "It's a snowstorm, but it isn't a blizzard," Helen corrected. "Just get your butt out of that warm bed and get dressed. You are going to have to loan me some clothes," Helen said. "Well, I'm not taking a shower then going out in the cold, so I guess this will just be a continuation of last night," Peter said as he pulled her to him and kissed her. Peter pulled on clean underwear, but replaced the thermal underwear from the day before. He found a clean set for Helen. There were a little large on her, but they were held in place by her clothes from the night before. His jeans were way too big, but she needed team to turn the snow. They both had the shape of a snowman when they left the apartment for the block and a half walk to the restaurant. The walk was miserable even if they were dressed for the cold. Peter wore good ski gloves while Helen wore the fancier leather and rabbit fur gloves. In spite of how it looked, the synthetic gloves he wore were warmer. The restaurant was closed when they arrived in the late afternoon. The restaurant had obviously decided not to serve dinner that night, probably because they could only get customers within walking distance of the place. The area's residents were not likely to venture out in the snowstorm, since they were all older citizens or yuppies whose SUVs were not suitable for the kind of weather coming down that evening. "If we go on another block that way, we should get to a small grocery store. We can carry enough food for a nice dinner," Peter suggested. "What if they are not open?" Helen asked. "Then it's going to be a long night," Peter said. "We need to hurry before the sun goes down." He fully expected sundown would end everyone's day. "Let's go," Helen said. The store was still open only because the owner lived over it. Even though it was open, almost everything was gone. "Looks like you had a hell of a day," Peter said to the Middle Eastern man wearing a robe. The man obviously wanted to close and go upstairs for dinner. Peter threw a loaf of unsliced bread into a shopping bag. He also found a can of cherries, a jar of baked beans, and a wedge of cheese. Peter paid $10 for groceries, which were selling for $5 the day before. There were city ordinances against gouging prices during a natural disaster, but Peter never even thought of reporting the man. "So how did you get God to cooperate in turning a one-night stand into a weekend event?" Helen asked Peter. "I just live right," Peter said. It turned out that the weekend didn't end on Sunday. The two of them stayed naked until Tuesday after lunch. They did dress long enough to go out to dinner and shop the neighborhood grocery once the snow ended. When Peter finally pushed Helen's 3-year-old Ford out of the parking space and into the drive lane, which had been cleared only hours before, it was filled with their dirty laundry. Helen had a washer-dryer, so she volunteered to do the laundry for him. There was a huge amount of it. Several carefully packed plastic grocery bags filled her trunk. Helen dropped him in the parking lot of his building several hours later with the clothes inside the same plastic bags. By that time, the clothes were folded neatly, not rolled into tight wads. After dragging all the bags up the stairs, Peter was ready to meet the icy world himself. He went to dinner alone, then returned home to watch TV. His only stop along the way was the consignment store where he bought even more sweatshirts for $3 each. "I need to go to the big box store," he said to the TV. He knew it would not be a bike trip until his fancy new battery arrived. Even then, he had his doubts about the ability to operate in the cold. While he gave some thought to the new batteries which were supposedly be on a boat to the U.S. port of Los Angeles at that very moment, he searched the TV for something half interesting to watch. He caught the teaser for Gold Diggers. According to the teaser, the show had been filmed with the live cast right up to the point that person or persons unknown had killed Miles Adair, the lead character, while he parked on a lonely farm road. He was there preparing to head into the gold camp. Peter became curious about the mystery. The video had been edited to 6 one-hour shows. The plan was to run them over the course of 6 days. One new one, and the one from the night before. It had become a common move for the docudrama channels to run a new and old show on the same night. He was fascinated by all who done it. Add to that a modern gold miner, and you had a mystery of greater interest. Then toss in that he was a retired cop, and you had a magnet for Peter. The trick was going to be to investigating the high-profile case without blowing his cover. There were a couple of things in his favor. He had never been within 1,000 miles of any location mentioned in the Google information of the show or murder. He really wanted to do the investigation, but he wasn't sure it would be possible. It was an active, ongoing investigation. They might not want to cooperate with an outsider. No matter how smart he thought he was, Peter decided. Peter went to bed with no plan at all. Even after watching episode 1 of Gold Digger. The first episode was a reenactment of what they had done up until the TV show approached them. It wasn't boring, but it wasn't a barn burner either. Peter knew that he wanted to interview the production crew, but that would mean publicity. He knew that Seth would be livid. "Hey, you going to come to work today?" Helen asked the next morning over the phone. "Sure, why not?" Peter said. "So you want a ride?" she asked. "No, I might want to stop somewhere on the way home," Peter said. He had in mind upgrading his small tablet to a laptop computer. That would require a trip to the big box store. If he made the trip during his lunch hour, he could take it to the office, unpack it, then get it home on the bike. He could have done it all if he had imposed on Helen. That was something he did not intend to do, even though he was sure she would be willing. The day worked just as he planned. By 5 o'clock, he had a new state-of-the-art Dell laptop computer. The salesman convinced him to buy a wireless mouse, so he was all set. Better yet, it came in a small package. He could fit it all in the backpack which he had brought from his original home. It took up much less than half the thickness of the pack. It also left plenty of room on the sides. He piggybacked the office Wi-Fi that afternoon to download episode 1 of the Gold Digger show. He intended to download the show in its entirety, 1 episode at a time. "Deacon, you got a minute?" Trish the Fish asked. "Sure. What can I do for you?" Peter asked. "I'm bored," she said. "What are you working on?" "Those files," he said, pointing to the pile of blue folders on his desk. "I have to work them after you and Wilson your legal review," Peter replied. "Come on, Deke, find something," she almost demanded. "Most of the time law enforcement, and I'm sure the practice of law is boring as hell. Imagine being a real estate lawyer," Peter suggested. "You two are planning something, I'm sure of it." "So spill it," Helen said. She had walked up behind Trish. "Watch Gold Digger on the docudrama network tonight from 8 to 10. We can discuss it tomorrow." They both knew he had ended the conversation. Trish called the head of internal affairs at the Chicago PD. Have them recheck the club that the victim was supposed to have been threatening Waters with. Check it for DNA. Be sure that they can identify everyone who handled it. Waters' DNA should not be on the handle. The Vic's wife's DNA may or may not have been on it. If it comes up no one's DNA is on it, then someone cleaned it after the fact, and then you have a much larger problem. "Break it up," Iva said. "Deacon, we need to talk." "Sure. You want to talk here or in your office?" he asked. "Outside. I need a cigarette, so get your coat." Deacon got his coat and went out the rear door. The rear entrance was from the alley where the retail stores and restaurants took their deliveries. Usually there was nothing to see, but that morning everybody was trying to resupply, so there were about twice as many trucks as there were empty loading docks. "I made from a nasty mess in the snow-covered alley. You have been here 2 weeks and solved a murder. No one else even though of as a murder. You kept up with you files, maybe it was half, but doing of your real job, and maybe not. You came up with several areas of inquiry on them that I had never considered. I think it's safe to say that we need to work out a deal. This is going to be a negotiation, not a capitulation," Iva the Terrible said. "So let's hear your offer," Peter said. "DOJ has agreed to provide you as a consultant. You will have assigned duties, but you would not be an employee of this office. You can assume all my communications with you are simply suggestions. We need not argue about them or have any other communications. You may not use other paid employees for your research. You report your findings to me and I will direct any follow-up. The DOJ has opened a low-priority line of research for me based only on your recommendations. They will do your criminal investigation research, not legal appeals information. It all sounds rather confusing, Peter suggested. It's brand new operating procedures, so it is going to take some getting used to. You will not be making contact with the DOJ. Only I can do that, Iva said. I work for you, but I get paid by the DOJ. I get paid by the DOJ, but I can't contact the DOJ. It's all pretty silly if you ask me, Peter said. Tell me about it, Iva said. Peter had no intention of telling her that he had always been accepting reward payments from the DOJ's war on narcotics recovery funds. He also didn't tell her the no direct contact was to protect him, not her. So what is the DOJ offering? Peter asked. $20,000 a year and expenses on any out-of-town trips, Iva said. Seth had negotiated it, no doubt. It gave everyone something, and no one got everything they wanted. It seemed to be a good deal for all. Hell, he thought. Since he never saw anything in writing from the DOJ, he might be paying his own salary from the reward fund. He didn't care, he lived simply. It was necessary to stay off Paco Gomez's radar, so he couldn't spend what he had at the moment. Money had never been the issue. He just wanted her to have some skin in the game. A thing is only worth the value you put on it. Since Iva wasn't willing to pay, she lost control over him. As a consultant, he could refuse to do as she demanded at any time. He would of course lose the cover of Just Act, so it was not a course of action to be taken lightly. So do you understand? Iva asked. I have it, but do you understand? Peter asked. We will just have to feel our way along, Iva said with a formal smile. She was still very much trying to be the boss. Once he was back inside, he sat in the cubbyhole to read another file. The first thing he always did was to pull the evidence inventory. He placed it to the side so that he could compare it to the incident report. He would expect to find items missing from the inventory, not things added. In the case of Susan Smith, there was a matchbook in evidence which, according to all the reports, was never recovered from the scene. It made for a huge break in the chain of evidence. Peter carried the file back to Trish's cubby. Did you review this file? He asked. Yes, I did, she said with a questioning look. Did you find any line of inquiry based on the matchbook? Peter asked. Not that I remember, Trish said. Take another look, please. The chain of custody is broken for the matchbook, Peter explained. If they based only line of questioning on it, we can get it tossed, maybe, she said. Now I'm curious to know who recovered it and why they didn't log it into evidence. It just showed up on the inventory with no name on the recovery tag. It is probably an oversight, but maybe not. Evidence is always an easy way for a cop to influence the outcome of a trial, Peter said. It isn't mentioned in any discovery to the defense, so it must not have been used, Trish said. We can track it down tomorrow. Time to close up shop. Peter looked up at the large Clover Dairy clock on the wall and found that it was sure enough 5 till 5. Well, time does have a habit of marching on, the thought. Do you need a ride home? Trish asked. No, I rode the bike. I'm just going to put on my doughboy costume and ride it home, Peter said. How about you give me a sawbuck for your share and I stop at a restaurant and meet you at your place? We can watch your TV show together? Trish suggested. For his part, Peter packed the new computer into his backpack and hung it from the hook behind the seat. He rode carefully on the icy roadway. After he had the trike stored, he walked from the basement to his third-floor apartment. Since Trish knew the way, he hadn't waited for her. She was waiting by the door for him. I see you made it before me, even though you stopped for food, Peter said. Gee, it's so easy when one is smart enough to call ahead, she said. Once the door was open, she continued. You have what would almost pass for a bed. You also have a porch rocker in your living room. It's a knock-together one. When I went to the big box store, I bought it and brought it home in a taxi. It's just plastic with a thrift store throw pillow, Peter explained. It looks comfortable, Trish said. Well, you have your one comfortable chair. Thank you, Trish said with no warmth in her voice at all. She might as well have been discussing some point of order in a courtroom. No wonder she hasn't been hired anywhere, he thought. It looked as though every foreign food was heavy with vegetables or pasta. Peter, like most men, wanted fried meat and potatoes. He ate his share of the Indian food with Diet Coke, also brought by Trish. Thanks, Trish, it was good, he said without any real feeling. Unlike Trish, it was unusual for him not to have an opinion. You didn't like it? She asked. It was fine. I'm just not crazy about bland vegetables, he replied, hoping she wouldn't be offended. I'll keep that in mind, she said, again with no emotion. You don't have to do that, Peter said. You should buy the things you like. Why do you say that? Wouldn't you rather have input into what I bring? She asked. Not necessarily, but that's okay, he replied. There was an awkward silence while the two of them finished the food. Then from nowhere she asked, Do you want to have sex with me now or after the TV show? Let's just wait and play it by ear. Everything doesn't have to be scheduled, he said. What do you want? Spontaneous is fine, she said, turning her attention to the small dorm-sized TV. Oh hell, we have an hour till the show begins. How about we make out? I would like that, Trish agreed. The two of them kissed and groped each other until out of nowhere Trish said, "It's time for the show." Since Peter had already seen the show, he mostly watched it for the details of the uncle and his niece's life. It was hinted at more than explained. Peter also paid attention to the backgrounds and the forest scenes. It seemed that Miles Adair warned the producer about moonshiners and pot farmers might be a threat. He didn't play it up any more than he did the threat of landowners having them arrested for trespassing. It was obviously not a big concern for him, just something of which the producers might want to be aware. The first show didn't tell anything about his relationship with the show's technical staff. It was something that needed to be explored with the niece. Peter made notes as the show unfolded. Since the hint of sexuality would make the show more interesting, I expect it was just as it seemed, Peter said. They went back to watching the show. During the break between episodes, Trish said, "Helen said you were a great lover." That was nice of her, but I'm still not comfortable with you two comparing notes. She asked, Trish said without so much as a smile. Her voice was also flat. She was just stating facts, not defending herself. "And you gave me a 7? Peter asked with a laugh. "It is better than just average," Trish said. "It does leave room for improvement." "Let's save the discussion about improvement until the lights are out at least," Peter said. "Okay, but I don't understand," Trish said. The second episode featured the history lady who was quite a bit older than the niece. It was also obvious that the niece and the production company were trying to throw Miles and AITA together as the show's love interest. Even so, most of that episode was about the uncle in the woods. He spent his time prospecting for sites to set up a dredge operation. Peter found that the show was mildly interesting, even without the mystery. He wondered how it played to Trish. "Trish, how do you like the show?" he asked when episode 2 was over. "I like the niece and her uncle. I think the show's production company might be trying to portray the older woman as sort of a villain," she said. "I think we need to know about this QE2 production company," Peter said, revealing that he had an interest greater than simply a TV gold story. "The other on-screen people should be easy enough to find," Trish agreed happily. The difference in her demeanor between happy and concerned was minuscule. "Well, yes, but first we need to get copies of the police file. For that we need to wait for DOJ to get it for us. We should be able to start work on it without the file," Trish said. "Trish, I can't ask you to help. It would just get us both in trouble," Peter replied. "What is Iva the Terrible going to do? Since I am an unpaid volunteer, she can't fire me," Trish said. "I've been meaning to ask you. If you are an unpaid volunteer and Just Act doesn't pay you, how do you live?" Peter asked. "I could tell you, but then I would have to kill you," she said, pretending to be serious, "and she did a hell of a job. This wouldn't look good on your resume. I mean, being fired from a non-paying job is pretty damning." Peter said, "If you cause me to get fired, I bet I could come live with you," Trish said. "Of course you would have to buy a larger bed," she demanded. He had to kiss her to shut her up. They found their way into the tiny bed. Eventually, Peter even found his way to sleep. Peter couldn't give Trish much of an alibi if she needed one. He woke up in the middle of the night and saw her sitting naked in his large plastic rocking chair. The only light in the room was the glow of the light from her smartphone. The image was just a blur, so he drifted off again. Since it was a work day, she was gone when he awoke. He skipped the cereal so that he could stop along the way to work for breakfast and warm up coffee. The only restaurant open on the way to work was across from an auto dealer. Lots of people seemed to walk over from the dealer's building. He parked the trike on the sidewalk and went inside. There was seating inside for about 20 people. He could tell the building was from the fast food mold. Those kinds of buildings were all over town. High-volume fast food had given way to the lower-volume neighborhood cafe. He could imagine how much the rent had shrunk as well. After breakfast, he completed his ride to the office. Iva was in, so he went directly to her cubby. "Would you call your friend as the DOJ and request a copy of the gold digger investigation? The victim was named Miles Adair?" Peter suggested. "What's this all about?" Iva asked. "I know it sounds like I'm being sexist, but she just looked so washed out, and with her slightly crooked nose and really, really bad hair, it made her look like a witch. She also had a proclivity toward dark clothing." "Are you caught up with our files?" she asked. "For the moment, Helen is doing all the checks necessary," Peter said. "All right, I will forward your request. I am sure our contact at the DOJ wasn't expecting the request from you to start so soon," she suggested. "What better time to start testing the limits?" Peter said, turning to walk into the cubby with the coffee pot. "How was your date with Trish?" Helen asked as she entered the cubby we jokingly called the break room. It was larger than the others by a long shot. It also had a refrigerator with lots of bottled water. It was across from the old janitor's closet with the deep soapstone sink. We are interested in the same things now and then. The Gold Digger show is one of those things, Peter said. Be careful, Trish is weird, Helen said. Oh, Peter said, pretending he had no idea what she was talking about. What makes you say that? He asked. She called me after midnight to tell me either I had low standards or you were better with me than her, Helen said with a laugh. I think she was probably bored. Bored? Peter said. Well, maybe I fell asleep. Unlike you, she is not demanding. I will explain it to her when I get her alone, Helen agreed. The two of them and the never-ending files kept Peter busy as the Gold Digger marathon ended and time began to drag. Helen managed to track down the QE2 production company. Their office was in New York. The unauthorized investigation now, and then threw the three of us together outside of work. Since Helen's job would be in jeopardy if word got out, she was helping but keeping it quiet. Like someone had said, Peter's apartment became Catch-a-Killer Central. While they waited for the files to arrive from DOJ, Peter finished recording all the Gold Digger series, and Trish attended the IAD interview with Officer Waters. Trish explained that it might have ended in a draw had the facts uncovered by Peter and his crew not been introduced. After a day of questioning, everyone in the room knew that he had murdered Vicky's husband. He didn't want to give her up, so he was going to take all the blame. He was still in love with her. Such were the complicated interactions of people in love. Trish never understood them. The Just Act gang closed the file on Officer Waters and Vicky without being satisfied that justice was really done. The files on the Gold Digger murder file showed up a few days later, just before there was about to be a mass suicide from boredom. Peter should have been thrilled since either Helen or Trish watched the shows with him and spent the night afterward. Truth was, he was feeling cramped by the two of them. There seemed to be a consensus that after the file from DOJ arrived, they all would be looking into the murders. The file arrived, and it was filled with cold, sterile facts. The story in that file was less than half what the sheriff in the mountains knew. It was a start. Miles Adair had been shot with a .40 caliber handgun. He was shot at close range. There was no evidence that he made any attempt to defend himself. He likely knew the killer and allowed him to drive up. The cops surmised that it was a member of the production crew, so the cameraman was suspect number one until they found he had an alibi and no motive at all. The farm road hadn't been scraped in years. Worse yet, at the time it had been frozen off and on for months. Their result was that there were no usable tire patterns in the packed dirt and frozen gravel surface. In the crime scene photos, it appeared that Miles had been loading a drag sled to carry his supplies for the next part of the dig into the site. There were a set of pictures of the gold camp included in the file. Peter made notes as he researched the file. He made a note to ask Louise Adair about the machinery on the work site. If she didn't know, surely the cameraman did. He learned from the series that the gold mining operation broke even, but not a whole lot more. Louise was the only one who needed the money. Miles and Ada did it more to prove a point than anything else. Peter had been in Detroit for almost 2 months when he said to Helen and Trish, "It's time I talked to the usual suspects in the Gold Digger case." "Not without me, you don't," Trish answered. "I would feel better if you went along," Helen said before Peter could object. "She can't protect you, but she can call the cops. I would hate to think of you rotting in the mountains." "Trish, it will be diner food and cheap motels, but since you aren't being paid, I assume you can be gone for a couple of weeks," Peter suggested. "Yes, I can," she said with that rot up her voice. "Well, Helen, we will miss you," Peter said. Trish said, "Yes, we will." Helen asked, "So when you leaving?" "I need to rent a car. I have a fear of flying," Peter explained. His fear was of being seen in an airport. "You don't need to rent a car. We can use my car. You pay all the other expenses and we will be even," Trish said in that professor's voice she used often. "Fair enough. How long will you need to be ready?" Peter asked. "I can go home and pack my toothbrush and be at your place in an hour," Trish said. "I was thinking more like tomorrow morning," Peter suggested. "Oh," Trish said. "I can do that easily." Peter's packing would consist of his toothbrush, some underwear, and his wad of cash. He generally packed light, but this time it was going to be even lighter since he tended to have more dirty laundry than clean clothes. "Why don't you come to my place tonight? If you do, we can do your laundry," Helen insisted. "Sure, I will need to say goodbye," Peter said. When Trish and Peter left on their trip to the small university town, a couple of 100 miles from the mining site, they were going to be looking for Louise. The drive was 800 miles from Detroit to the town where Miles had lived. It took the best part of the day, even in the big fancy sedan Trish furnished. Peter first found out about the big Lincoln sedan when he met Trish in the parking lot of his place early in the morning. He stood looking out the window of the apartment building with his clothes for the trip in a larger version of his getaway backpack. When she pulled up in the black Lincoln, he didn't recognize her. She had to beep for him. He had expected the Econobox she usually drove. "So you were rich?" "I had a sneaking suspicion that you were," he asked. He immediately flashed on the socialite parents and a stern childhood nanny. "I am not rich at all. I live on a small trust fund. I just have use of the family assets," Trish said. "Sounds like a nice life," Peter said. "I'm 25 years old and still live on an allowance of sorts. I have to ask to borrow the car for God's sake," she said as she pulled from the lot. "Can you imagine doing that?" "Obviously not, or I wouldn't be jealous," Peter replied. "Our plan was to ambush Louise, so we hadn't called ahead, which turned out to be a mistake. Should we wait for tomorrow to approach her, or should we call now, or maybe just go over and risk it?" Peter asked Trish. "Call her and ask if we can come over now," she replied. "Maybe we should call her and AITA and try to arrange a breakfast meeting with both," Peter suggested. "You tell me what you want to do. We can try any of those options," Trish agreed. "Let's call Louise first, then check into a motel," Peter suggested. They stopped for dinner at one of the chain date night restaurants before they checked into the small older motel. Peter expected a hooker to be their neighbor, but it turned out to be a college student, and what was obviously an older woman. Screwing for a better grade, obviously, Peter thought, but said nothing. It was Peter and Trish's first night in a full-sized bed. It was a treat. Some things just weren't possible in the cot he owned. They spent a lot of time enjoying the larger bed, so they overslept. They had made an appointment to meet Louise early the next morning for breakfast. It was her choice to invite AITA. Peter and Trish had to skip their showers in order not to be late for the interview. "One of you must be Louise Adair," Peter said to the two women at the table by the window. "I am Louise Adair, and this is our former business partner, AITA Fine," the younger of the woman said. She had a stern look about her, but it appeared to be mixed with a lot of pain. Peter, though. Louise looked sad but was attractive in that schoolgirl way. "It is good that you both could make it this morning. Trish, my associate, and I really appreciate it. Could you bring me up to speed about the last trip home before your uncle's death?" Peter asked after the introductions. "Uncle Miles came home for Christmas and stayed till New Year's. Then he went back to the mountains," Louise said. "There isn't a lot more to say. The shooting took place on a private road which led into the gold camp. Did your uncle say there had been any trouble, no matter how small at the claim?" Peter asked. "He didn't mention anything," Louise said. "He did have some kind of hush thing going on with Sylvia from QE2. I thought they were dating and that it was cute," Louise said. Immediately AITA jumped in. "It was nothing. They just spent a little time together. I know Sylvia is your daughter, but she and Uncle Miles were up to something. There were phone calls and whispered conversations that ended when anyone came in the room." "That just screams conspiracy," Louise said. "I'm sure it was just not wanting the crew to know they were sleeping together," AITA said. "Did Sylvia visit you uncle at the home you shared?" Peter asked. "Who did you say you were with?" AITA asked. "We are with Just Act. It is an independent legal advocacy group. It is authorized by the Department of Justice to act as an oversight group," Trish said in her cold voice. "Well, we are done here, I suppose," Peter said, laying his card on the table. "Call any of those numbers if you have any questions, or just need to talk." Peter got Trish out of the restaurant before AITA could pull out her phone and take his picture. He knew it was risky, but he had chance. When AITA started asking questions, he decided her daughter might be too much of a risk. In the car, Trish said, "We were about to find out something. Why did we leave? We are going to have to separate them to find out anything. Their stories are different. Louise thinks something Miles did or with Sylvia got his butt shot. AITA, who is Sylvia's mother, thinks he was just screwing her. So we can figure that if Louise is right, AITA will only obstruct us." "Okay, I can see that. So what is our next move?" Trish asked. "We give her till lunch to contact us. If she doesn't, you contact her to ask if she would like to talk, just the two of you," Peter suggested. "Deke, this is some serious shit. If one of the people off Miles, they might decide to do one or both of us," she said. "Yeah, are you having fun yet?" he asked. She actually smiled when she nodded her head. Since there was no longer a production crew in town to interview, the two of them played Louise like a fish. The calls started in the afternoon. First it was AITA. She wanted to talk to Peter alone. He agreed to meet her in the park on the university campus. He had a feeling that she wanted to interview him. "She most likely wants to know what I know about her daughter," he thought. Trish called Louise after AITA called. Louise agreed to meet her at an upscale restaurant and pub for a drink. "It's cold on this park bench," AITA said. "Tends to encourage people to get to the point," Peter replied. I suppose so, Ada said. Sylvia had nothing to do with Miles' death. You know this how? Peter asked. She and I spent the day together, she said. I told the police the same thing and they were satisfied. Did you also give them the name of an independent party who could verify that? Peter asked. Yes, I did, she said. Let me guess, the cameraman, Peter said. As a matter of fact, yes. She stopped in to see Sylvia at my house while we were having lunch, so I invited her to stay for a turkey sandwich. Ada said. Ada, you know that isn't the best alibi, but it's better than none, Peter said. I'm still going to New York to interview your daughter. If I find out you are covering for her. His voice trailed off when he realized the threat would not help. Do you know who did kill Miles Adair? He asked Ada. If I did, I would tell Louise. I want her to bury this theory that Sylvia or I had something to do with it, she said. Peter decided he didn't like Ada, but he couldn't see her as the killer. Still, there was the Mama Grizzly possibility. She would lie, and probably go a lot farther if she thought she was protecting her daughter. Peter felt that it was most likely going to be a messy investigation. All murder investigations got messy. Unless the killer was a psychopath, there were all sorts of crap involved. He wondered how well the killer of Miles Adair had covered his or her tracks. He walked back to the entrance gate of the university where he was able to find a cab. The driver carried him to the motel for $5. It was after midnight when Trish came in. She looked very relaxed. Peter knew the look. He had no idea what it meant since she had been with Louise for the last few hours. I was getting worried. What's the word on Louise? He asked. She really wants to help, Trish said. She loved her uncle. It was like you said, according to her. No sex involved, just two lonely people living in the same house. He left the house to her. Is it valuable? Peter asked. Not really. It is just a small frame house outside of town. Certainly not a motive for her to murder her uncle, Trish said. I see. Maybe a jealous boyfriend did it. No, it was not a crime of passion. If one of the people here did it, they had to follow him 4 hours by car to do it. He or she would have had more than enough time to calm down, Peter said. Louise thinks she knew something on Sylvia. She is convinced that Sylvia is involved somehow. Trish said. So what is Louise like? I think she is telling the truth, Trish said flatly. Then unless something comes up, we will move off Louise. It's time for a road trip, Peter said. We are on a road trip now, Trish said, being a little irritating. All right, a side road trip, Peter replied with a smile. They had dressed, or undressed, for bed. He fell asleep in Trish's arms. Peter spent most of the night trying to figure it out. His wild imagination and knowledge of the facts told him that he didn't have enough facts. He plugged the case file into the DOJ tablet, which he suspected was hardwired to the NSA. The idea was to read the police interview reports on all the participants. Since Miles had been killed in a rural county, after the crime scene investigation, the sheriff's office turned the investigation over to the state police. Under the new organization, there were regional detective offices. That being the case, Peter planned to move his review after reading the regional file yet again. He needed to determine if there was any reason to meet with the state agents. The state people had met Ada and Louise shortly after the shooting. They both started out on the radar because Miles had a .38 revolver which he hadn't tried to use. It appeared that he watched the other car drive up and park. The locals and the state men expected that he knew his killer. Since he didn't know anyone locally, they turned an eye on his partners. Louise was interviewed and then eliminated. Since she had been with her parents for several days, her alibi was solid. The investigators liked Ada for about a day, then decided to move on to Sylvia. She alibi was the same as her mother's. It wasn't a perfect alibi, but the cops couldn't break it. The other two possibilities were the camera people. One was part of the alibi for Sylvia and Ada. She had been in town waiting for filming to restart after the holiday. The police hadn't known about her affair with Louise until they ran the names past Louise. Louise immediately admitted to the affair. According to Louise, it was just sex, not love. Miles was cool with it. She said there was no reason for either of us to kill him. At least that was the quote from the report. The male cameraman was interviewed while he was still in the area. According to him, he was supposed to meet Miles at the cabin in the Gold Camp. Unlike Miles, he pulled a small camper along. His plan was to commute from the camper parked about 2 miles away on the fire road. The farmer who owned the land where the Gold Camp stood discovered the body while he was still on the road. He had a credit card receipt for gas purchase 200 miles away a half hour before the murder. The cameraman genuinely liked Miles, and there was no motive of any kind for him to end his life. The gun used for killing Miles never showed up, so the case went cold after a few weeks. There were too many jurisdictions to really do an adequate job. If Miles had been a movie star or had caught the public attention, it might have been different. Hell, it might be different now that the TV series had been released. Peter couldn't decide where to go looking for the missing pieces of the puzzle. He needed to talk to the QE2 players. A quick call to New York confirmed that the camera people and the producers were in the field. So what now? Trish asked. Now we go back to Helen, Peter said. We need her to do the computer search on Miles and the other financial records. When the two of them arrived back in Detroit, the work week was almost over. Peter went into the office. Since he had a stack of files to review, he went through them quickly but carefully. Believe it or not, the two things are not mutually exclusive. Just doing his job and ignoring the larger context cut the review time in half. Peter explained to Iva that he was still going to be coming and going for the next couple of weeks. Then he cornered Helen to solicit her help with the records check. You know, the cops did all this. Why not just get copies of their reports? Helen asked. I could kiss you, Peter said to Helen. Later, she said. Like after dinner tonight. As a matter of fact, why don't you pack up your laundry and we can do it after you take me to a nice dinner? Even better, we can do it all day tomorrow. It is Saturday. You don't have to do that, Peter said. Hey, Trish is younger and prettier, but I'm more useful, she said. Not to mention more comfortable. No comment, Peter said. I'll take off early and be waiting for you, clothes in hand, after work. Good, you can use my machines, but tomorrow you are going to have to do the work. I am going to be busy reading the financial information for all the parties, Helen suggested. Fair enough, Peter agreed. They had dinner and then each other. Peter slept very well in Helen's big, comfortable bed. After breakfast, Peter retrieved the files from his DOJ-furnished pad. It had the heavy encryption programs on it. Even though it was not a national security matter, the information came from a huge research project DOJ ran. Seth had moved Peter's request along through channels, probably because he felt needed to make up for almost getting him killed. Peter had bypassed Iva's clear directive that all DOJ requests had to go through her. It was getting pretty clear that the partnership between the two of them was finished. It also seemed fairly obvious that their days as employer and employee was wearing thin. He expected that if he didn't solve the mystery on the gold claim, they were through. Well, here is your smoking gun. Sylvia made cash withdrawal from her business account. She made the five $9,500 withdrawals and won $5,000. Even you can figure out that she paid for something more than a manicure, Helen said. Maybe she paid for someone to shoot Miles while she ate turkey sandwiches with her mother. Miles suggested. So I'm going to go over the case notes again, just to see if anyone picked up on it. Since she had an alibi, even if the people were all connected to her somehow, they might have given up on her as a suspect. The police did what anyone else would have. They ran the best leads first. They most likely felt that Ada was the better lead. Hell, Peter even thought so. Motives ran from jealousy to secret gold deposits. It just depended on the time of day. Sylvia's motives could also have been the same. The $50K added a new dimension. Miles didn't seem the type to be blackmailing her. His financial records were in order, at least according to Helen. No one seemed to have received the money. It looked more and more like hitman money. Peter swore to himself that Sylvia had some explaining to do when he arrived in New York. The production staff from the Gold Digger show were busy working on a new show called Homefront. That show was a family living in a Trenton, New Jersey block of row houses. The family was doing a reenactment of how it was to live the 1939 lifestyle. They had found a row house that had restored. The TV show money was going to be used to retire the department. Peter was pretty sure that the show was going to require some creative editing. Helen and Peter had amassed a hell of a lot of information that Saturday evening. They had also washed, dried, and folded a lot of clothes. By 6 p.m. they had a line of inquiry and a place to start. I'm here for my update, Trish said as she entered the rear door of Helen's small house. Well, the DOJ did a dump on Helen. She has been organizing it since I downloaded it, Peter said. She was able to find a money trail. Trish turned her attention to Helen. It wasn't so much a trail as a bump in the trail. DOJ found a series of suspicious bank transactions that the state police missed for some unknown reason, Helen said. It's more like they didn't recognize the importance of them to their case, Peter added. Police coordination between agencies is terrible. Access to the federal database is essential for crimes covering multiple jurisdictions, like the DOJ says. They gather info and store it, but without an investigation asking the right questions, the information just sits there. You are thinking she paid someone to shoot Miles Adair? Trish asked. Unless she can explain it away, that's exactly what I think, Peter said. So are we headed for New York? Trish asked. No, first we are headed to Philadelphia, Peter said. I want to ask the camera people some pointed questions. I thought all your questions were pointed, Trish said. I'm sure it seems that way, he agreed. After it was all explained to Trish, Helen brought out a bottle of wine. Peter stayed with coffee while the women began to relax. So I hear you interviewed Louise Adair. What was she like? Helen asked after the wine bottle was half gone. Trish looked at Peter. He shook his head just a little. It was to reassure her that he hadn't told Helen any secrets. Helen could tell she had hid an interesting vein of information. A college girl living with a single uncle. There must have been some sexual tension there, Helen suggested. There was no indication of anything other than them sharing a house. She kept the place clean as payment for her rent, Trish explained. I think she is not straight. Oh, and how come you are so positive? Did you sleep with her? Helen asked, laughing. Yes, Trish said. Then she went on without a second's hesitation. Should I go for more wine? Honey, you are one twisted girl. I like that, Helen said. Next morning, Trish said, I want pancakes. Helen and Peter both broke into laughter. Trish spoke again. What? Come on, let me take a shower and we can go to the IPD for pancakes, Peter suggested. Half an hour later, Peter looked across the table at Trish. She wore the same jeans she had worn to Helen's house. Helen loaned her a much too large sweatshirt for the skinny Trish. They were separated by a 10 years difference in age. Their body types were totally different and so was their attitudes. While they ate their pancakes, Helen was all giggly and Trish was serious as a heart attack. Peter wondered again how he came to be sitting across from the two of them in a booth. Helen looked as if there might be something going on under the table. Trish looked as though she was enjoying the pancakes. She did make a quiet growling sound now and then. Peter had heard it before, so he realized she was sexually aroused. The night before they had the boy was I drunk last night excuse. Peter's had no excuse, except that he was just a dog. All right, you two, one of you needs to drive me home, Peter said in the parking lot outside the pancake house. Peter had been the one to pay since he was the one with the most disposable income. I can do it, Trish said. She looked at Helen to see the disapproval in her eyes. What? She asked. Nothing. I just thought we would all hang out, she asked. You two hang out. I have to stop in the office to clear my backlog. If I don't, Iva the Terrible will have a hissy fit, and rightly so. You are right. I should go in as well. I haven't touched a file in almost a week. I would rather go to New York, and I hate New York, Trish said. I have plenty of exciting housework to do, Helen said with her face all screwed up in pain. I should get some cleaning supplies and work on my tiny little place as well, Peter said. But I choose to read files instead. Iva will appreciate it, I'm sure, Helen said. Your cubicle is overrun with files, none of which has your signature pink post-it note attached. Okay, Trish, drop me at my place, and I'll vacuum while I have the energy, Helen stated with a smile. Tell me something, Trish, Peter said as they drove toward his place with her trunk filled with his laundry. Sure, what do you wish to know? She asked. I have never been to your place. You live with your parents, don't you? Peter asked. Trish didn't answer for a couple of seconds, which seemed like minutes. Yes, she said simply. You have a maid, don't you? He asked, not letting it go even though she seemed uncomfortable with it. Yes, the family has maid service. I don't have a maid, she said. Oh, do you do your own laundry? He asked, thinking about the bags of his clean clothes in the trunk of her car. No, someone on the household staff does it. Peter, before you go on, I know you don't approve of our lifestyle. My father wouldn't approve of yours either, she said. That's fair enough, Peter said and stopped talking. That short Q&A did explain why he had never been to her place. Why she would make love a tiny cot rather than a larger bed at her place. She had no place of her own. She was the dorky nerd from high school who hadn't moved on, at least in her head. She had rejected her parents' lifestyle, as we all do. But she couldn't force herself to leave the comfort and safety of the lifestyle either. In other words, she was just as screwed up as everyone else, he thought. Peter managed to drop his laundry in a couple of minutes. Since Trish was waiting in the car, he simply didn't put anything away. Actually, she was on the cell phone when he returned. He caught the last few words. Mother, I really have to go. I just wanted to let you know Peter isn't a serial killer. She gazed over at Peter when she said the last. Love you to Mother. Peter thought that it was too formal even for the rich and famous, but he said nothing. The drive to the office was short once they were back on the road. Let's call it a night. I'm tired of reading police reports. Besides, Helen's and basket runneth over, Peter said. Good idea. I have finished reviewing all the files that Heckle and Jekyll didn't get around to reading, Trish said. So when do we leave for the East Coast? She asked. I plan to give Iva another day tomorrow. While Helen works out the details, then we either head for Philly or the Big Apple, Peter said. Is it time to rent a car yet? Not unless there is something wrong with the Lincoln, she said. Not at all. I just didn't want to take anything for granted. So how about dinner? he asked. I know you think I'm weird, but how about takeout? We can stop by and pick up a pizza and a salad, she suggested. Sure, was his reply. He probably meant sure I think you were weird, but it wasn't what he said. After dinner, they watched a couple of week-old TV shows streamed from the web. Then they went to bed. They slept on the small cot, all piled on top of each other. Tomorrow after work, we need to buy another one of those things, Trish said, pointing to the cot. I want one of my own. An hour later, they stood in front of the boss's desk. Well, I see you rose from the dead. You two look awfully good for zombies, she said. What? Did you expected us to check in with you? Peter said just before Trish apologized. Well, it would have been nice. So, are you back to stay? She asked. Actually, I am trying to make contact with a company in New York called QE2. Once I talk to them, I will try to run them to ground, Peter said it, trying to keep Helen out of it. Can I assume from the files in Helen's basket that you will catch up on them all before you leave again? Iva asked. I will review what I can before I leave again. I'm getting faster at it, but I will do what I can even if I don't finish, Peter said. Well, since it's more than we had before, I guess I can't complain, Iva said, clearly biting her tongue. Peter hardly spoke to Trish. He did manage to find her in the break room a couple of times. Helen found the production crew. She got the location from the TV network, then called the QE2 office. They agreed to set up interviews in Trenton, New Jersey for us. I didn't know that Trenton was across the river from Philadelphia, Trish said. I did. I think I read it somewhere. So when do we need to be there? Peter asked. Wednesday morning. Sylvia is even coming down from New York, Trish said. She is going to be there to make sure their stories match. Why do you say that? She asked. Because it is what I would do, Peter said. Yes, I guess it is, Trish said. Helen wants us to have dinner with her tonight, since we will be leaving tomorrow. It was a simple statement of fact, since she knew I would not say no. Should we pack the car before we go to her place? Peter asked. Trish nodded without showing the least bit of emotion. It's going to be another nightmare of coordination, Peter thought. Trish dropped him at the thrift store first. He bought another cot, just like the first one. After walking it home in the cold, he waited for Trish to arrive, then rode with her to buy an airbed before heading to Helen's for dinner. She had made a casserole from a good brand mac and cheese. Since her version had extra cheese and bacon, it was delicious. They made for a strange-looking group. There was Trish, the mid-20s skinny blonde with hardly any curves. Then there was Peter, early 30s male, who was carrying about 20 pounds of soft living on his once junky thin frame. Last but not least was the around 40 Helen with her barn-red hair and voluptuous body. They weren't traffic stoppers by any means, but they were each mildly attractive and, if taken as a whole, an interesting mix. When they were finished using Helen's one shower, thank God there was a half bath in the older house, they left the house in 2 cars for the drive to a family-style restaurant for breakfast. Nobody knows me here, Helen said when they were seated. Why does that matter? Peter asked. I am definitely going to want to kiss you both goodbye in the parking lot, she said, looking at Trish with one of those stupid men expressions. The drive to Trenton put them on the outskirts at 8 p.m. The motel was an economy version of a commercial traveler's motel. It might still be a bit below what Trish was used to, but Peter didn't care. She could check them into a frou-frou place when she paid the bill. Peter had the cell number for Sylvia, so he called to make arrangements. He had to leave a message. This is Peter Sims of Just Act. I need to firm up a time for the interview of your production crew. Call me. I think you have my cell number. Even so, he left the number on her phone. The call from Sylvia at 10 p.m. Hello, Peter said into the phone. This is Sylvia from QE2. I think you want to talk to me, the voice asked. Yes, ma'am, Peter said. We would like a time that would be convenient to visit the homefront location to interview your production crew. According to our schedule, the father is going to be home at 5 tomorrow, but the wife will be in the row house all day. So what does that mean? Peter asked. Jerry will be with the mother, shooting all the things she does during a typical day. Mike will be at work with the father, Sylvia informed him. I need an address for the father's workplace. You could also warn the house camera person that we will be dropping in on her. We are hoping to finish with the 2 of them before noon. Certainly, but I was hoping we could get it all done before end of day. I know you want to talk to me as well as the production crew. If we arrange a meeting for, say, 1, will you be finished by 5? If no, I will be forced to stay another day? Sylvia asked. I hope to be finished with the questions tomorrow as well, Peter said. But we will have to wait to see. Peter awoke with a terrible need to use the bathroom. There was absolutely no schedule in his life of late. I didn't help that he was unable to sleep through the night for some reason. He had at least slept well the night before. He went to bed early, and even Trish fell instantly asleep. Neither of them seemed to have missed their goodnight kisses. They took turns in the bathroom that morning, beginning with Peter. After his shower, he dressed in very casual clothing. He wore very cheap work clothes from Walmart's house brand line. After the shower, he used the $10 electric hair trimmer on his hair and beard. When he had finished, every visible hair on his body was the same length. He looked like an egg which had been dropped onto the floor of a house with a short-haired dog. He and Trish left the motel room with their luggage. He hoped he would have no need for the room at the end of that day. Since they only had one car, the decision to work together had been easy. They could work together on the interviews if they didn't step on each other's toes. The first decision to make was where to start. Their first decision of the day was to decide it, not to decide till after breakfast. Since Trish was driving, she found a fast food joint for breakfast. From the drive-through window, her GPS directed them to a neighborhood park. The two of them sat in the park and ate breakfast inside the small car. The view was of a few mothers watching their small kids play on the jungle gym. "So which of the camera crew do we go for first?" Trish asked. "Let's get Jerry first." She, Sylvia, and AITA share a common alibi. Hers is going to be the least likely to have changed. That is if she was telling the truth and can remember it. Peter said, "You know Miles was shot, so either of the women could have managed it. I'm sure there was conflict, since Miles wasn't likely unhappy with Jerry. After all, according to Louise, Miles knew that Jerry was the one who turned her on to women. Her uncle was mostly likely old school." Trish said, "True, but that seems like a pretty weak motive," according to Peter. "If she is a radical feminist, she wouldn't need much of a motive," Trish said. "Well, we can assess her probability, but my money is still on Sylvia somehow," Peter repeated. "Trish, when we get to the house, you make the introductions," Peter demanded. "Sure, boss," she said. They rang the twist bell handle sticking out a hole in the door. That handle was attached to the bell hanging inside the door. It might have been more turn of the century than the 40s, but it was old for sure. "Good morning," Trish said to the plain-looking woman dressed in a kind of smock over her dress who answered the door. "Come in. We have been expecting you," the very modern-looking woman holding the video camera said. "I assume you are Jerry," Trish said. "I'm Trish, and this is my associate Peter." "Nice to meet you both," she said. "We need you to concentrate. Could you put that camera down, please?" Peter asked from behind the thick-rimmed glasses he wore. The glasses had been supplied by the DOJ equipment room. They were tinted just enough to distort the color and shape of his eyes. He also wore a hard rubber molar guard in his mouth which distorted the shape of his teeth and cheekbones. Both items were uncomfortable, so he hoped they could finish the interview with Jerry quickly. "Sure. So what do you need?" Jerry asked, aiming her question at Trish. "How did you and Miles Adair get along?" Peter asked. He was trying to ruffle her feathers just a little. "I had very little to do with Miles. I knew him, of course, and I filmed him a very few times when Eddie couldn't. Mostly Eddie did the out in the woods filming, and I filmed the office work and the planning," Jerry said. "We are going to see Eddie after we leave you," Peter said. "How did you and Louise get along?" Trish said. Jerry looked at her a long time, probably trying to decide what she knew. "Louise and I got along fine. So did Professor Fine and I." "Did Miles get angry when he discovered you had seduced his niece?" Trish asked. "Not at all," Jerry said. "I stayed with Louise several nights, and he never said a word." "You really don't think I killed him, do you?" she asked. "Right now, everyone and no one is a suspect. You know, it does seem strange that 3 people who had close contact with the victim all have the same alibi," Peter said. "It might seem strange to you, but that's just what happens sometimes. As Freud once said, sometimes a turkey sandwich is just a turkey sandwich," she said. "Sometimes it just happens. Not as often as you might think," Trish said. "So, do you have any idea who might have wanted Miles dead?" Peter asked. "I thought that they had about decided that it was a moonshiner or pot farmer," Jerry said. "I don't think so, but it's possible. We are going to give it a few more days, then call it a lost cause," Peter said. He stood abruptly, then added, "Thanks for your help." In the car, Trish said, "So is she a suspect?" "Everyone is. On a scale of 1 to 10, she is about a 3 based on motive and alibi. Maybe we will have better luck with Eddie, but I doubt it. We are just covering all the bases." "They are fully invested in the moonshiners or pot grower theory," Trish said. "It has an appeal on many levels. It is a better TV angle than mistaken identity. Of course, no one wants it to be one of the crew. That would be really bad for business," Peter said. "I guess. So where to?" Trish asked. According to Sylvia, Eddie is filming the removal of a tree. "The star of Homefront is a landscape contractor," Peter said. "When I arrived on scene," he added, "he doesn't use real-type mowers or hand saws I see, so he isn't all that authentic." Eddie, he said to the man holding the camera. Yes, you must be Trish and Peter. Sylvia said you were coming to talk about Miles, he suggested. Yes, we are, Trish answered. So what can you tell us? Did Miles seem to be worried about anything near the end? No, he seemed confident, but careful. He mentioned that there were strangers who might be dangerous. I was surprised when someone managed to get close enough to shoot him, Eddie said. Yes, we are working on the theory that someone he knew pulled the trigger. Peter. Could be anyone, Eddie agreed. It's a good thing you were on the road when it happened, since you were spending a lot of time with Miles. All retired cops think they know everything, Trish said. She was getting the feel for the interrogations. He was very knowledgeable about the gold mining. He also kept me in the loop, so I didn't have to drag shit out of him. He was one of the better people I have worked with, Eddie said. So who killed him? Peter asked. Just some random moonshiner, Eddie said. That's what I think. Miles always said that if we had trouble, it would most likely be from moonshiners, pot farmers, or a pissed-off landowner. Since he had paid the landowner for the mining rights, it seems likely to be one of the others, he said. A few more questions and Peter gave up. Eddie knew very little, it seemed. Since he was a video man, he might be able to doctor his alibi file, but he just didn't seem to be hiding anything. Besides, he thought Miles was still at his house. They were supposed to drive up together the next day, but Miles left early. So Sylvia is the next one for us to interview, Trish said. It was almost time for dinner when Peter and Trish arrived at the hotel room belonging to Sylvia. She most likely realized how the interrogations were run. Being on her home field, even if it was a rental, made it much easier to refuse to cooperate. The first thing Peter did was to move the interview to the coffee shop. It was empty enough inside the coffee shop so that they could sit alone far from the other customers. Now you have your coffee, can we get on with it? Sylvia demanded. Did you kill Miles Adair? He asked. Of course not, she said. She stopped just as soon as she answered. She obviously intended to volunteer nothing. So, do you know who did kill him? Peter asked. If I knew who killed Miles, I would tell you. I really did like him, Sylvia. It also cost us a lot of money. We had to take a dead loss on all the cost of production. We managed to salvage the first shows, but we won't have a second season. That's a big deal. Do you have any idea who we should look at? Peter asked. Not a clue, Sylvia said. Well, there is one thing I need to ask you about. I'm hoping we can solve the problem before I need to get the police to look into it, Peter said. Are you threatening me? Sylvia asked. Yes, Peter said, then shut up. What do you think you know? Sylvia asked. Well, I know for a fact that you drew $50K from the bank. You don't seem like a narcotics salesman, so I have to assume it was most likely to pay someone to kill Miles. It wasn't found because the timing was all wrong for the local police. Once I put them onto your finances, it will all unravel, Peter said. You can't prove I had anything to do with Miles' death, because I didn't. Sylvia said. She also opened her purse and showed him $50K in cash. It was for a business investment that got canceled. I was going to produce the show's second season myself. Well, I'm going to have to let the DOJ or the local police figure out about the money. No cop likes that much cash in a handbag. They're going to turn your life upside down looking for that money. The reason they will do that is I am going to claim you are giving aid to a terror organizations. Do I have your word that if I tell you, you will keep it in confidence? Sylvia asked. Of course, Peter said. Like you said, Miles was a former cop. I asked him to pay a man to keep a secret. He did that, and a few days later he was killed. The man he paid lived 300 miles from where Miles lived. He also lived 700 miles from where Miles was killed. I don't see how he could have had anything to do with Miles' death, Sylvia said. Write down where I can find him. I don't need to know what you were paying him to keep quiet. Just tell me where to find him. I will try to interview him, and if it checks out, you have seen the end of me. Peter said. Then I'm sure I won't be seeing you again, Sylvia said. Did you know Jerry and Louise were sleeping together? She seduced Louise, Trish said. That has nothing to do with me, Sylvia said. Unless you plan to use her as a way to add drama to the show. Louise told me that you guys were all about the drama. Trish added. What has that got to do with Miles' death? Sylvia asked. Truth is, you just never know, Peter said. He had no idea what difference it made, but he was not going to allow her to intimidate Trish either. Trish was back behind the wheel of the Lincoln when she said, I think she is lying. Hell, they are probably all lying. This trip was all about gathering information. What we do with it once we analyze it is where the art comes in, Peter said. I have a feeling that you aren't kidding. You have a feel for this shit, don't you? Trish asked. Well, I have some unique incidents in my background that makes it possible to weigh all the possibilities, Peter said. 2 hours into the drive home, they stopped at an economy motel. The owner seemed to be Persian. The motel itself seemed to be more upscale than the mom and pop version of a Middle Eastern motel. The lobby didn't smell of exotic food for one thing. Thank God. Peter and Trish finally made love that night. Since the mission was accomplished, Peter wasn't nearly as wound up. Relaxing was the secret to making love. At least it was for Peter. The next morning they took turns in the bathroom. With Trish it took over an hour just to get her in and out of the bathroom. Since the interviews were over, they were in no hurry to get out the door of the motel and on the road. On the way back to the highway they almost passed a Waffle House. Instead of driving by it, Trish did an abrupt turn into the parking lot. Peter found the food adequate. Trish on the other hand ate like a lumberjack. She usually did the act of sex mused. At least you have a good appetite, Peter commented. I like breakfast after sex, she said. I'll bet you love the Sunday brunch in those fancy places in your usual world, Peter said. What do you mean by that? Trish asked. Go into any breakfast restaurant, especially high-end ones, on a Sunday morning. You will find several couples where either the man or the woman is in jeans. The other half of the couple will be in his or her fancy date outfit. Peter said with a laugh. I see. I will have to remember to carry a pair of jeans and sweatshirt when I go out henceforth. Trish said very seriously. So now do we go home? Trish often changed subjects abruptly. The new subject never failed to catch Peter off guard. Well, it's either that or we push on to the Southland again. The murder site is 200 miles closer than the university was. Unfortunately, both are almost 1,000 miles from Michigan, Peter said. We can go home and rest up and help Iva with the work for a while. We can also make better plans after I have digested this latest stuff. There is almost certainly something I'm missing, Peter said. Something we are missing. I'm a full partner, Trish said angrily. What has got your cage all shaky? Peter asked. Oh, just the blank future after all this time. For some reason nobody wants to hire me, she complained. I certainly can't understand that, Peter said looking out the window. You do know your people skills need work. I know, but I'm just not good at that kind of thing, she said. They began their drive for home late that morning. The two of them spent one more night in a trucker's motel along the interstate highway. Peter held her all the night. Since Peter's plans for the investigation's future were very fluid, he allowed himself to oversleep. The two of them left the motel around 10 a.m. They had coffee in their room from the brewery machine supplied with the room. It made 1 cup of coffee at a time, so it was a time-consuming process for Peter. This coffee and this wasn't bad, just a lot of trouble, Peter said to no one at all. This from the man whose coffee ritual is more labor-intensive than the whole gold digger operation was, Trish said. True, but I make several cups of coffee at a time. This is the whole thing for 1 single cup of coffee, Peter explained to her. Yes, but each cup is fresh, Trish said, defending her position. How stale can your coffee get in 10 minutes? Peter said. We should decide to disagree before World War III breaks out, Trish said in her dead voice. Even that harmless comment was out of character for her. Fair enough, we have a long drive home, so let's get to it, Peter suggested. The drive wasn't all that long at all for a trucker, but it was for them. They drove most of the day to arrive in Detroit in time to advise Iva in person that they would be returning to the office the next day. They also really wanted to see Helen. So did you miss us? Peter asked Helen. Let's see. I had time to clean my house, so not really. You have only been gone a couple of days. Now I might have gotten excited if you had been gone longer, she said with a smile. Do you want to go out for dinner, or should we bring something over? Peter asked. Let's eat takeout, Trish suggested while standing in front of Helen's desk. She looked like a kid called into the principal's office. Find something other than pizza, and you have a deal, Helen agreed. I need to go by the apartment to be sure it hasn't been broken into or anything, Peter said. Then you two do your little thing, whatever that is, then come be a geek bearing gifts. I will throw the junk in the corner to make room for our feast. You Peter Sims can play with your computer and plot after dinner. Trish and I will find some way to amuse ourselves, Helen said, smiling at Trish. Have I just been told to sleep alone tonight? Peter asked with a smile. Not at all, just to allow us some girl time, Helen explained. We need some structure once this case is finished, Trish said. What kind of structure, like a schedule? Helen asked. Yeah, am I allowed to be here on odd days of the month? Peter asked with a laugh. Nothing like that. I just think we don't need 3 separate apartments, Trish said. Trish, you don't even have one apartment, Helen said. Well, I want one now, Trish said. I passed the bar. I'm sure I will get a job soon. In the meantime, I have a little trust fund income. I would pay my share of the expenses. I just think we should all move in together. Well, it would solve that awkward first date thing, Helen said. I don't know about Peter. Yeah, what about Peter? What's in it for me? Peter asked. Clean clothes, hot food, and hot and cold running sex. What more could any man ask for? Trish commented. Well, I have to admit it sounds good. It's not like I'm giving up my dream apartment or anything, Peter said. The truth was that it was a small upgrade. The downside was he would be expected to fix the dripping sinks, and her house badly needed painting. He would also likely need an automobile to get around. For him, it would be a lot of trouble for sure initially, but it did have the washer and dryer. The move also had the hot meal thing going for it. Peter decided to leave it to Helen. He would just go along. Helen said, "The problem is that there is only one full bath. If we are all going out to dinner at the same time, that could be a problem," Peter said reasonably. "There is that half bath in your bedroom," Trish said to Helen, "so there won't be any accidents." "You are persistent, but if we do this we are going to need rules," Helen said. "My God, do you intend to have a no shoes in the house rule?" "If you do, it's deal breaker," Peter said. "No, but one rule is you keep your shit in your own space. You also must clean up after yourself," Helen informed Peter sternly. "Oh, I see," he agreed. "So what do you think?" "I don't know, it will probably work," Helen said. "But you two get this straight, I'm your lover, not your mother." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Trish said. "So sit down and figure what it's going to take to make this work money-wise," Peter demanded. "I can tell you right now the fixed expenses run just under $1,500, Helen said. "Part of the appeal was home-cooked meals," Peter said. "It might have been home-cooked meals, but there was nothing about me being the one who cooks them. You can use my kitchen, if you want, but only if you clean up after yourselves," Helen said. "Why are you being such a hard Helen?" Trish asked. "Because I have raised 2 kids and now I'm free. I am willing to have you 2 as roommates, but like I said, I'm not going to be your mother." "Works for me," Peter said. After a week, Peter enjoyed everything about his new living situation. That only thing he didn't like was giving up the apartment. He had a feeling that he would be regretting it. He might even have kept it, except that the women talked about a lack of commitment as if that were a bad thing. The 3 of them lived and worked together for several weeks, mostly because he couldn't seem to catch a break at work. The volume of new cases was just awful. Since he didn't have a clue where to go next on the gold digger murder, he just kind of drifted along until deep in February. All that changed when Helen came to his cubicle on the last day of that short month. It had been over 2 years since the murder. "I found where that dude who was blackmailing Sylvia can be found," she said. "Well, give it up," Peter said. The not-so-gentlemanly friend of Sylvia's was killed in a holdup gone wrong. He was only 22 at the time. The convenience store clerk must have looked like easy pickings to him. When demanded the clerk give up the money, he didn't expect the clerk to resist, Helen said. "Let me guess," Peter said. "He wasn't a clerk at all. He owned the store?" "Exactly, and he made up for his inability to fight or chase down mischief makers in other ways," Trish guessed, since she was standing behind Helen. "You two take all the fun out of giving you the news," the 70-year-old man said, and I quote, "I whipped out my piece and shot the punk," Helen explained. "Good for him, but bad for us," Trish suggested. "Dead men tell no tales." "I didn't have much faith in him as a suspect anyway," Peter revealed. "He would have no way of knowing when or where he would find Miles. I think our best bet for a next move is to visit the scene of the crime." On Friday, Peter dropped the news on Iva. At the end of the day, he would be leaving for a visit to the spot where Miles' body had been found. "You know, you really need to decide whether you want to work here or not. I mean, you just take off for a week or 2 at a time," Iva said. "Okay, I'll give it some thought during this trip," Peter promised. He did not change his plans. Trish came walking out of her cubicle at the sound of their voices. "What is going on?" she asked. "Are you going on the road trip as well?" Iva the Terrible asked. "As a matter of fact, I am. We aren't sure how long we will be gone. The good news is after this one, we don't have any idea when or where we will go next," Trish said honestly. Iva walked away in disgust. If Trish's family were not so connected to just act, she might have given Trish the veiled ultimatum as well. Instead, she made noises as she walked away. Peter and Trish had worked diligently since their return a couple of months before. That being the case, Peter didn't feel any guilt at all, and if Trish did, she didn't show it. Since Helen's kids were on the way home from college for the weekend, she wanted the 3 roommates to take at least a couple of nights off from their relationship. She planned to spend the weekend with her kids in her house. Trish agreed to attend a fancy dinner party at her parents' mansion on Saturday night, since she had to be away from Helen's. She grudgingly agreed to allow Helen's son to sleep in her bed Friday and Saturday nights. "Trish can be so strange," Helen admitted with a smile. "I had to agree to clean her room completely after the kids left. Well, they can use mine and won't even need to clean it when they leave." Hell, they can even leave a couple of their stray girls behind, Peter said. Easy, Peter, Helen said with a grin. Term will be over in a couple of months. Well, I can find a place for the summer, Peter said. Trish can always move home for a couple of months. I was hoping you might do something like that. You do know you are the bestest, Helen replied. I will probably need a break from all this free love by then, Peter said, trying to downplay it. It actually played to his benefit, since he was trying to keep the relationship as casual as possible. Since Peter and Trish had gone to Helen's during lunch to pack, after work they went directly to the Days Inn to check Peter into the motel for the weekend. The plan was simple. Trish and Peter would spend Friday night in the motel, then go to breakfast Saturday morning before Peter dropped Trish at the mansion on the hill. He would have the use of the car until Sunday, when he would pick her up again for the road trip. Since Trish was a bit of a clean freak, Peter drove to a real restaurant Saturday night. If there were going to be any takeout stains in her car, they would be hers, not his. He also no longer drank, so the car was not likely to have any serious damage, he rationalized. When he left her at her house, he realized that he hadn't driven a car in several months. It was nice to just drive wherever he wanted without doing any calculations about how far he could make it. Gas engines were good for that, at least. They had even come a long way as far as reliability. Even so, the small engines were still basically unreliable. After dropping Trish, Peter went to the hardware store. There were several other errands he used it for as well. Finally, he ended with a trip to Helen's. Once there, he had dinner with Helen and her children. He willingly submitted himself to an interrogation. The boy and girl college students spent most of their time sending and receiving text messages or checking on their Facebook pages. It was ridiculous, and he decided right there to never go out of public with them. It also didn't help that he had nothing to say to them after hello. Peter was in bed by 11 p.m. It wasn't the first time he had slept alone since the arrangement, but it was one of the few. He was surprised how easy it was to sleep knowing Helen and Trish weren't in the house. After lunch on Sunday, Peter drove to the mansion on the hill. He called her while on the road. "So you ready to return to the great unwashed?" he asked. "I am so ready," she said. "However, there is a problem." "Oh?" Peter asked. "My dad insists on meeting you," Trish said. "I don't do meet the parents," Peter said. It had as much to do with his personality as it did with protecting his cover. The cover ID was the important consideration. "Peter, if you don't do this, he is going to hire private investigators to research you. It would be best to just meet with him and convince him we are just work colleagues," Trish assured him. 5 minutes, no more," Peter said as he pulled into the drive. It was 20 minutes later when he placed a suitcase into the trunk of her car. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the closed box. "It's my coffee-making kit from the apartment," Peter explained. "I thought I would take it on this trip. If you don't have some warm clothes packed, you should maybe pack them." "You told me that already." "That's what is in the suitcase which you just put in the trunk," Trish explained. They were almost at the motel when she asked, "So what did you think of my father?" "He was what I expected," Peter said. "I'm sure I will hear his opinion of you whether I like it or not," Trish admitted. "Of course you will. You are his daughter after all," Peter explained. The plan had always been to leave for the mountain where Miles died immediately. They were well on the road when Trish got the call from her dad. Peter watched her make faces as she listened to his opinion of their relationship. Her father didn't like it, of course. Peter wondered how her father would react if he knew the extent of Trish's depravity. "It's official, he hates you," she said. "That's strange. It usually takes at least 2 meetings before people hate me," Peter said with a smile. "No, that's a good thing," she said with a giggle. "If you say so," Peter agreed. They drove until midnight, then checked into a highway motel. They slept in the same bed but kept their distance. It had been a long, trying weekend. Over a late breakfast the next morning, Trish asked, "I wonder how Helen's weekend went?" "The kids seemed curious about our relationship," Peter explained. "So what did she tell them?" Trish asked. "She told them that I was in Detroit temporarily to help review cases for the DOJ. I asked to be a housemate for a while, and she agreed," Peter replied. "What about me?" Trish said. "You," she explained, "needed to get away from your parent for a while. She explained to the kids that she knew us both from work, so she was sure we were harmless. She needed the help with their college expenses. I think she added that God knows their father was no help," Peter explained. "Yeah, that sounds like Helen for sure," Trish said. They rode in silence for a long time. The introspection passed too quickly for Peter. It was interrupted by Trish's speaking. "Iva the Terrible gave you an ultimatum, didn't she?" Trish asked. "Yes, she did. It wasn't quite that strong, but it pretty much was. She just lacked the courage to deliver it with the strength needed. It is what it is, though." "What are you going to do?" Trish asked. "No idea at all," Peter replied. My dad had a long talk with me over the weekend, Trish said. Oh yeah, is he going to spring for the personality transplant? Peter said cruelly. He had no idea why he had done that. Not funny, Pete, she said, knowing he didn't like to be called Pete. You do know you can be a shit? Your language has really gone downhill since you began hanging out with me, Peter said with a chuckle. The mood in her Econobox was not at all contentious, but it was cooler than usual. Something was hanging over them like a sword. They stopped for dinner, then drove a couple of more hours to get to within 50 miles of the highway exit for the gold camp. Peter smiled every time he thought of the operation as a gold camp, but he had to call it something. Since Trish drove, Peter used the tablet attached to her wireless carrier to research the area. He found that when they turned from the interstate onto the state road, they would come upon a local motel. From the motel, it was still an hour's drive, on a state road, to the site of Gold Camp. The motel staff would surely know where the local residents could be found. It was well after dark when Trish pulled onto the exit ramp which led to the state road. The motel was not one of those quaint places with local charm. It was instead a two-story concrete block warehouse for people. Most likely it began life 40 or so years before as an econ lodge, or some such thing. The parking lot restaurant was still operating at an average small-town diner level. After they checked into their barely adequate room, they went to the restaurant to have an only adequate dinner. Though the motel owner seemed to be an immigrant, the restaurant owner seemed to be a local businessman. At the time, he was working the register, so Peter tried to engage him in conversation. So did you know any of the production people for the Gold Digger show? He asked as he checked out. Yeah, the cameraman stayed at the motel. Also, when the producer came to look over the site, she stayed as well. They also seem to come in every couple of days to sleep in a bed and to shower, the owner said. The waitresses talked to them more than I did. Come back in the morning and talk to Jill. She got the cameraman to film her. He promised to show her film to the producer when he got back to New York. I don't know what she promised him in payment, the manager said with a smile. Any other strangers hanging around when the miner got himself killed? Peter asked. We get a lot of strangers here. Jill will know better than me, the owner said, looking past Peter since there was a customer wanting to check out. Peter and Trish went to their room for the night. Since Peter had seen the small microwave in the room, he unloaded his box of coffee-making materials. He set about making coffee 2 cups at a time. Trish waited until the first of the foul brew was made before she spoke. So what are you thinking? She asked. We need to hike into the gold camp and take a look. Most of the police effort was spent on the crime scene. We should talk to the sheriff's office to see the evidence and determine what they did. But we should also hike into the camp to see what, if anything, is there. You know, the murder was over 2 years' time ago. Since it happened so long again, I bet the passing of time has wiped away every trace of Gold Camp, Trish said. The fact that Trish called the place by his nickname didn't get by Peter. Maybe, but even that might tell us something. So which do you want to do first? He asked her. Is this another of your subtle test questions? Trish asked. Of course, Peter replied. Cops first, then the scene, then the Gold Camp, Trish commented. Very good. Was it a guess? He asked. Not quite. I thought we should know as much as possible before we visit the scene, and the cops have most of the available information here, Trish said. Excellent thinking, Peter said. I want you to drive by the road to Gold Camp before we go to the sheriff's station, just so we know what to ask. Fair enough. So do you want to have sex with me tonight? They were getting to be friends again, but she was still so cold. Sure. How do you feel about it? Peter said. Of course, or I wouldn't ask, she acknowledged. It made sense. It was almost like a teenage boy asking a girl, if I kissed you, would you be upset? Peter thought. The next morning, the two of them left early for the Gold Camp Road. They did stop at the restaurant in the parking lot, but found Jill wasn't working and no one else knew about the production crew. They didn't stay for breakfast. They also didn't see another restaurant during the drive to the Gold Camp turn-off. It made Peter think his decision had been a poor one when he decided to wait for a place closer to Gold Camp. They found nothing of interest near the Gold Camp turn-off either, so they began to follow the GPS's instructions to the sheriff's substation. They did find a crossroads dinner near the sheriff's office, which sold sandwiches of all kinds. The diner also sold breakfast biscuits all day, along with their several sandwiches. He and Trish ordered coffee and biscuits, then they talked to the waitress and grill cook. Did any of those TV production people eat here a couple of years ago? The ones making that Gold Digger show? Trish asked. That cameraman and the one who got himself killed ate here a few times. Not toward the end, though, the grill cook said. Then a few minutes later, they found themselves at the sheriff's substation. So, you are the guy from DC. What can we do for you? The chief deputy asked. I want copies of everything you have on the Gold Digger murder, Peter said. Oh yeah, all the 911 and dispatch tape too, and from the deputies around the time of murder all the way up till the body was found, Peter said. Why do you want that? The chief deputy asked. That is an incomplete record of that night, but they are the only things available. You never know what might turn up. Peter said. Sure, I will have the 911 and dispatch calls sent to you. I have the case file copy for you now. He said that, handing Peter a flash drive. Since Peter had called the day before, even though it had been a Sunday, the word had managed to filter down. Actually, there were several words. He wanted to see the deputy who handled the crime scene investigation, as well as any evidence list and all the paperwork. Deputy Silas presented herself to Trish and Peter. Would you like a cup of coffee? Peter asked. He made it obvious that he wanted her alone for the interview. He just didn't want it to happen in an interrogation room. The female deputy agreed to meet them in 5 minutes at the same diner where they had breakfast. You back again? The grill cook asked. Coffee was so good. I couldn't stay away, Peter said. Both tables were, so the three of them carried their coffee to the one farthermost from the door for their talk. So Deputy Silas, what time did your start shift that day? Peter asked. I was working 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., she said. Remind me, what was the victim's time of death? Peter asked. The time of death was about noon, but the body wasn't found till just before 3 p.m. I got the call and was pissed I had to work over. According to the man standing by on the scene, he was supposed the cameraman and was supposed to meet the victim in the afternoon for the trip in, but the victim arrived way early. When the cameraman arrived, he found the Vic had been dead for some time, the deputy explained. So he had to leave home around 6 a.m. to get to that spot near noon. Why would he leave home so early when he wasn't supposed to arrive till later in the afternoon? Peter asked aloud, but to no one. Maybe it was nothing but a wild hair up his butt to get moving. I have no idea. There was no indication why the victim was in the woods at the time. His sled was half loaded when he was shot. Deputy Silas replied, even though Peter didn't aim the comment at her. Tell me something, Trish asked. Miles mentioned moonshiners and pot growers were in the mountains. Were they really dangerous? More so in the summer than in January. The pot farmers would be in grow houses, so not likely to be in the woods at all. During the summer, yeah, they are a problem. How about the shiners? Peter asked. They are active when the foliage covers them from the drones, Silas said. Is there anyone else in the woods who might be dangerous? Peter asked. If your man walked up on a grow operation or one being set up, it could be dangerous. Our deputies have been fired on in the woods more than once, Silas said. One was even hit. Tell me this, did the TV show advise you that Miles was going to be in the area? Peter asked. If they knew, nobody ever told me, she said. Peter got a chill. She had just parsed her words. She could have been covering her own butt and knew nothing, or she could have been covering her but because she suspected something. Peter didn't answer, he just looked at her hard. I guess that's all, Trish said. After Deputy Silas left, Trish asked, what now? We do what we do best. We start to research. You find out who all was on duty with the sheriff's department that day, Peter demanded. You have a theory, don't you? She asked. No, I have some questions. You find out who was working for the sheriff that day. I'm going to walk the ground where the gold camp was located. Oh yeah, find out who those deputies are who were shot at during their tramp in the woods, Peter said. After breakfast the next morning, Peter left Trish working on her research tasks while he stopped for coffee at the diner nearest the gold camp. Peter made a call while he drank coffee. He was in the field when he got the call. So you got my answers? He asked. Look for a pump in the creek and some hose leading up from the creek. If there is a cabin and some metal tables around, it might look like someone preparing the ground for a grow plots when the trees fill out in the spring. If I have all that, it could look like someone is getting it ready to plant when the weather breaks? He asked. Yes, it could, the voice on the phone replied. As Peter said thank you, he was staring at the pump used to carry creek water to the small metal tray used to wash rocks. He was also looking at the generator and propane tanks used to keep the miner's shack livable in the winter months. Peter had that bad feeling again. He didn't like what he was thinking, so he was sure the others weren't going to like it either. Can you get me that satellite feed from Jan 2 years ago? Peter asked the DOJ voice. I will have it for you tomorrow, the voice said. You know you are going to owe me big time. Okay, but you know secrecy is important. Peter replied. I know, Peter, don't worry. You just remember to hide behind that lawyer that you drag along, the voice said. Peter got back to the motel in the late afternoon. He began to school Trish in what he suspected happened. She verified one of the sheriff's investigator who had been shot at was working the day Miles died. So Deputy Diggs killed Miles? Trish asked. It's just a theory with not even circumstantial evidence backing it up at this time, Peter said. The two of them made love that night. then fell asleep exhausted. The time drifted by until the commotion in the parking lot woke the two of them. There was a sunset-type glow in the sky over the parking lot at 2 a.m. Peter rolled from the bed and walked naked to the windows. He saw Trish's Econobox burning across the parking lot. He was glad he had taken Witness Protection 101 in D.C. Seth's people had stressed never take a ground-floor motel unit and never park your car overnight in front of your motel unit or apartment. He resisted the urge to rush outside and catch a bullet for his trouble. Instead, while keeping as calm as possible, he walked to the sleeping Trish and said, "I think you are going to want to see this." It was time she realized it wasn't just an intellectual game in which they were involved. He waited beside the bed until she was awake, then led her to the window. He restrained her as the fire truck finally arrived. "What the hell happened?" she asked in a voice most women would use to advise her husband that she was going to the store. Her words were emotional, but the tone was just dead. "Glad to see you aren't going to get all gushy about it," Peter said. "Why should I? It's insured, and even if it weren't, it's just a car," she said, weighed illogically. "Most women would feel violated," Peter said, then changed the subject. "We need to see the parking lot CCTV tape before the cops do." After he spoke, Peter dressed quickly, then slipped the .38 Will gun into his belt under his parka before leaving for office. The whole family was present in the lobby and looking out the window. "I'm staying in room 213. That is my car that is burning out there in the parking lot. I want to view the surveillance tape," Peter demanded. There was something in his voice which made the motel owner comply. The old man gave him the security code to view the tape online. It showed a full-sized SUV pull through the parking lot. When it reached Trish's Econobox, the passenger threw a liquor bottle filled with gasoline on top of the smaller car. The bottle was followed by a road flare. The small car went up with a whoosh. There was no sound, but Peter remembered hearing the sound in his sleep. Maybe he just imagined that he had heard it. Peter sent Seth at the DOJ a link to the tape before it got lost. Then he went back to their room to await the local police. He found Trish on the phone at 2 a.m. "Who are you talking to?" he asked. "Daddy would never forgive me if I didn't call," Trish said. "Well, give the old scumsucker my love," Peter said. "My insurance company's claims agent?" she asked, genuinely confused. "Sorry, I forgot," Peter said, shaking his head. Peter heard only her end of the conversation, so he wasn't sure of the timing, but it appeared that the agent was going to arrange for a car to be delivered to the motel. She also seemed to agree to forward copies of the police report and pictures of the burned-out shell to the company. While Trish did all that, Peter made coffee. He even gave her one of the cups while they waited for the cops. "I bet you never hear the end of this," Peter said. "I bet you are right. Daddy will try to have a bodyguard accompany me everywhere," she said. "That might not be a bad idea," Peter said. He said it even though he knew it would be overkill. "Don't you get all protective of me," she said. "It's the things I like best about you, that you expect me to pull my own weight." A knock on the door prevented any further discussion. The two cops came into the room. They gave their names, which Peter ignored. They got all the fact while giving nothing away. Standard police bullshit, Peter thought. "So, any ideas what happened?" Peter asked. "Since you don't have any enemies, it's hard to say. Maybe a case of mistaken identity," the older cop said. "Probably all over now. Still, it might be a good idea to at least change motels." "Sounds like good advice," Trish said in her cold, flat voice. Peter knew that she was being sarcastic. She waited until they left, then said, "Goddamn cops." "At least that," Peter agreed. "So do we go home and do the rest of the research from there? We can have all our ducks in a row when we come back to spring the trap?" "Are you that confident?" Trish asked. "Not at all, but the odds just shortened a little. If we were miles off base, no one would bother to try to scare us off. The cops are the only ones who knew where we were staying. They had the access to the DMV records to recognize the car. The problem is there were 2 people used in the bombing." Peter explained it patiently. "So they were cops," Trish said. "Either that or cops provided the information they acted on," Peter explained. "Do you trust anyone?" Trish asked. "Or do you doubt everyone?" "No, don't answer that." "Trish, I will rent a car to finish this." "It is getting to be dangerous," Peter said. "No, hell you don't. You don't get to drag my butt all over the eastern seaboard, then dump me at the finish line," she said. It came out just as unemotional as everything else she said. "Very well," Peter said, "but I'm sending your father a text message." "Go ahead. Believe it or not, I do say no to him quite often. If I didn't, I wouldn't have met you. He wanted to buy me an internship in Craven & Craven," Trish said. "And they are," Peter said. "A huge corporate practice," Trish informed him. "Well, I'm glad you didn't let him." "You are a great friend," Peter said. "Friend?" Why you shit? I hope we are more than friends, Trish said. If we are more than friends, what does that make you and Helen? Peter asked. I guess that is another thing we need to work out when we get back to Detroit, Trish suggested. As I keep telling you, you need to go back now, Peter said. I'm staying at least till you figure out how to proceed. I am not leaving you stranded here, Trish said. Things started to pop just before lunch. At 11, the rental car was delivered. While Trish returned the driver to his office, Peter sent a text message to Seth at the DOJ. He explained his theory to Seth. He didn't know if Seth would take his hobby investigation seriously or not. The text he received later that day was simple. Book one room at the motel for a DOJ investigator. Even Trish knew they were about to get hijacked. Unlike Peter, she was livid. Peter had messaged Seth because he could not afford to have his cover blown, which it would be if the TV news cameras got wind of the story. It was most likely that they would. Paris Henson, the woman at the door, said. Then she added, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you. At least you have a sense of humor, Peter said with a smile. Oh, you thought I was joking, Paris said. She waved an FBI ID card in Trish's face. Well, I'm Trish and this is Peter. What makes you think we need help? Trish asked, still not happy by the intrusion. Young lady, I am here on orders. If you have a problem, have Mr. Rabbit here send a text to the boss. She said it before Peter could explain. What does Iva have to do with this? Trish asked. She didn't mean that, boss. I have a friend at the DOJ from the old days. He is her boss, not mine. Whatever. The older, heavier, Paris said. Whoever you are, Mr. Rabbit, you were supposed to walk me through the so-called evidence, then we can make a plan to try and prove it. First, Peter reeled off the players from the TV shows and their positions in the list of suspects. That is only for background, since we pretty much eliminated them. He also gave their alibis to explain why they were eliminated. That missing blackmail money needs to be looked into, Paris said. We researched it, but never could find what Miles or the blackmailer did with the unaccounted-for portion of it. It is just a dead end, Peter explained. Okay, so what do you think happened? I'm told by my boss that you have a bizarre theory, Paris said. We do. Okay, Blondie, what is your theory? Paris asked. I wouldn't make fun of her, Peter said. Her daddy plays golf with the president when he is in Detroit. Oh my, I should be careful. He might have me reassigned from this plum job, Paris added. How about we all try to get along? With a break or two, this won't last more than a couple of days, and you will be a heroine. Why not stop all this shit around and just tell me what it is you're thinking? Paris said. Peter went on to lay it out complete with charts and satellite images. He also explained that some of the information wasn't really open and above board. Marvin Diggs is who I suspect. He is a detective sergeant on the Vice Unit. When it comes to moonshine and pot grower convictions, he has a reputation as the best of the best. He was also shot at a couple of years ago by a pot grower protecting his turf. Peter pulled up the patrol sergeant's report describing the scene. Peter handed the tablet he was using for his presentation to Paris. Okay, it looks like he knew his assailant since he had a pistol still holstered and he surely saw them pull up, Paris said. That's what I thought, along with everyone else. We all wasted a lot of time on that theory, Peter said. What I think now is that Miles recognized him as a cop. Truthfully, I think it was the hero cop. Tell me why you think that, Paris demanded. Motive, means, opportunity, and he knew how to cover it up. I did some research, Peter said. He pulled up the satellite image from the week before Miles was killed. See this tiny cleaning on the stream? That was where Miles had the pump, and the hose carrying the water runs up that path to the miner's cabin. It's clearly shown there. Now the miner's shack viewed from the air could be a grow house, a still house, or a cookhouse. All kinds of things are possible. It's clear that something is going on there. I think Marvin wanted another gold star, so he waited until he could catch Miles at the site before he went up to check it out. I believe he used a webcam on the road to catch him coming in, so he would have arrived after Miles started to load the sled. Miles wouldn't have pulled a pistol on a cop, even if he pulled up on him. But why did the cop shoot a man for no reason? Paris asked. He might have, though he had a reason. Remember, this is a man with a history of being shot at by a narcotics gang, Peter replied. How much of this can you prove? She asked. Not a lot at the moment, but if you start to look officially, I think you can, Peter replied. Give me a copy of your research, and I'll recheck it after dinner. Then tomorrow I will have a long talk with Detective Marvin Diggs. I will interrogate him only if I don't find any holes in your research. He is going to have covered his tracks better than the average bad guy. Can you take Trish along for the meeting with the sheriff? Peter asked. I expected you to ask to go along. The boss said to be sure you didn't tag along, but he didn't mention Blondie. Sure, why not? She can distract them while I prod for information. We will talk at breakfast, Peter said. I don't like her, Trish said once Paris left the room. Why? Because she is a wise shit? Peter said. No, because she is a homophobic witch, Trish said with a smile. Ah, so if you can't charm them, they are homophobes? Peter asked. Of course, Trish agreed. At breakfast the next morning, Paris said, I looked it all over, and you don't have enough? What do you need? Peter asked. Some reason to get a search warrant for his computer, she said. Why don't you check the ballistics on his service weapon? Trish asked. That weapon has to be available for testing at any time. Are you going to make the accusation that Marvin shot Miles? Paris asked. Damn right I am, Trish said. Then we have Marvin brought in and I asked for a weapons check. That is when the shit begins to go rank. Paris said. Peter watched the two of them leave the parking lot in both cars. It looked as though he would have a chance to run around the internet while he awaited their return, which was just what he did at least until he fell asleep. Honey, we are home, Paris said. What time is it? Peter asked. 6 p.m. and all is right with the world, Trish said. You should have seen Paris bully those guys. First the sheriff wanted to stall, but Paris informed him that he didn't want to stonewall the DOJ. It was an official complaint brought by a member of the bar and therefore an officer of the court. She convinced him that he would be out in a second if the DOJ pressed charges for aiding and abetting Marvin Diggs against him. The sheriff called the homicide investigator, then Marvin Diggs. When asked for his service pistol, Marvin turned it over. Paris was sharp enough to ask if Marvin carried it on the morning Miles died. No, Marvin said. I dropped it in the river during a boat chase that spring. I thought Paris was sarcastic toward me. She showed him the tape from the motel parking lot. Then she identified the car as his son's. There was no tag, but there was a high school bumper sticker. When the DOJ got through with the video, one could even see the damaged corner on the sticker. Nice. Did you ask him how his son would like Bubba as his next prom date? Peter asked Paris. No, but I will next time, Paris said. The homicide man said I needed to keep quiet. You know, it's all just fill in the blanks now, Peter said. Yes, we seized his computer and he lawyered up. If he refuses to cooperate tomorrow, we go at him on federal charges. Paris said. It might take a month, but we are going to get his smart butt. Then I think I am going to let you take over, Peter said. That was the understanding I got from the boss. Well, Peter Rabbit, you done good for a cowboy. Best of all, nobody else died. Sometimes things just work out, right? Peter said. Paris stayed on, while Peter and Trish went back to face Iva the Terrible. In the car on the drive back, Trish asked, What next? I have no idea, Peter replied. I expect Paris will call to update you as time goes by, but like she said, it will take at least a month to have him arrested. The gun is never going to show up. Not the gun, no, but guess what? Diggs was involved in another shooting to remember. He had to give a sample of his bullet for comparison to the recovered rounds from the narco dealer. If they match, he may just start looking for a deal. Trish explained. Damn, you learn quick, Peter said. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.